Hey guys, tonight we begin the Vikings and their hidden fears. Let yourself settle in now. Pull your blanket a little closer. Let your shoulders drop, your breath slow. Tonight, we travel back through the centuries, across cold northern seas and into the mist-shrouded world of the Vikings. You know them as raiders, as warriors, as the terror of medieval Europe. Their longships appeared from the fog like ghosts, and villages burned in their wake. For nearly 300 years, the sight of a square sail on the horizon meant death was coming. But what you may not know, what so few ever speak of, is that even the Vikings had their fears. They were not invincible. They were not without doubt. Behind the iron helms and the dragon-proud ships, there were whispers of enemies they dared not face lightly. Enemies whose swords were just as sharp, whose walls would not fall, whose magic chilled even the bravest Norse blood. Tonight, we uncover them all. We will meet the kings who stood their ground, the empires that turned back the tide, the shamans whose curses haunted Viking dreams. We will sail with them into waters where even the boldest captains hesitated, and walk beside them into lands where their sagas fell silent. We will sail with them into waters where even the boldest captains hesitated, and walk beside them into lands where their sagas fell silent. This is not a story of weakness. It is a story of truth. For to understand what a warrior fears is to understand the warrior completely. So breathe slowly now. Let go of the waking world. There is nothing you need to do but listen. Let my voice carry you back across 1,000 years, to cold shores and ancient fires, to warriors and wanderers and the shadows they dared not name. We begin where all Viking stories begin, in the land of ice and fire, in the fjords and frozen forests of Scandinavia. A land so beautiful and so harsh that it shaped a people unlike any other. A people who would sail to the ends of the known world, and sometimes beyond. But also a people who knew, deep in their bones, that the world was full of dangers even they could not conquer. Tonight, we meet those dangers. And we do so gently, as the fire burns low and the stars turn overhead. But before we dive in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a small gesture that truly helps the channel grow, and I'm always curious to know where in the world you're listening from, and at what time of night. Let us begin at the very beginning. Not with the clash of swords or the roar of battle, but with something far quieter. Something older. Let us begin with the land itself. The ancient, beautiful, unforgiving land that gave birth to the Vikings. Breathe slowly now. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. There is no rush tonight. We have all the time in the world, and the story will unfold gently, like fog rolling across a northern sea. Picture, if you will, a world carved by ice. Millions of years ago, great glaciers crept across the Scandinavian peninsula, grinding down mountains, gouging out valleys, and leaving behind a landscape unlike any other on Earth. When the ice finally retreated, it revealed the fjords, those long, winding waterways that cut deep into the coastline like fingers reaching into the heart of the land. Some of these fjords stretch for over 100 miles. Their walls rise steep and sheer, cliffs of gray stone crowned with pine and birch, plunging down into waters so deep and dark they seem almost black. In the early morning, mist gathers in these valleys, drifting slow and soft, and the world becomes a place of silence and mystery. This is Norway. This is the western coast of Scandinavia. And this is where our story begins. The people who lived here, the ancestors of those we would come to call Vikings, were farmers and fishermen first. They settled along the edges of the fjords, wherever they could find enough flat land to build a home and grow a little barley. They raised cattle and sheep, hardy animals that could survive the long winters. They fished the cold waters for cod and herring, salting and drying their catch to last through the dark months. Life was not easy. It was never easy. The growing season was short, sometimes only a few months, and the winters were brutal beyond anything most of us can imagine. From November to February, the sun barely rose above the horizon. Days were brief gray twilights, and the nights seemed to stretch on forever, filled with the howling of wind and the creaking of ice. Imagine living through such a winter. Imagine your entire world shrinking down to the warmth of a single longhouse, the glow of a central hearth, the faces of your family gathered close. Outside, the snow piled higher than a man's head. The livestock were brought inside, yes, inside the house, because even they could not survive the cold without shelter. The smell of animals and smoke and unwashed wool filled the air, and the days blurred together in a rhythm of survival. But there was beauty too. There is always beauty, even in the harshest places. On clear nights, the northern lights danced across the sky, great ribbons of green and violet and pale gold, shimmering and shifting like something alive. The Norse called them many things. Some believed they were the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge connecting the world of men to the realm of the gods. Others thought they were the gleaming armor of the Valkyries, those warrior maidens who carried the souls of the brave to Valhalla. Whatever they believed, they watched in wonder. Just as you might watch them now, in your mind's eye, as you settle deeper into rest. Now you might wonder, what does this have to do with fear? What does the beauty of the northern lights, or the hardship of winter have to do with the warriors who would one day terrorize the coasts of Europe? Everything. It has everything to do with it. You see, the land shaped the people. The harshness of their home taught the Norse that the world was not a kind place. That survival was not guaranteed. That nature itself was a force to be respected, even feared. They learned this lesson in their bones, from the time they were small children. They learned it when the crops failed and the family went hungry. They learned it when the fishing boats did not return, lost to sudden storms. They learned it when the wolves came down from the mountains in the deepest part of winter, desperate and bold, circling the edges of the farmstead in the darkness. Fear, for the Norse, was not weakness. It was wisdom. A man who feared nothing was a fool, and fools did not live long in Scandinavia. This understanding would stay with them always, even as they grew into the raiders and explorers and conquerors the world would come to know. They were brave, yes. Astonishingly brave. They would sail across unknown oceans, charge into battles against overwhelming odds, settle in lands thousands of miles from home. But they were never reckless. They calculated their risks. They chose their targets carefully. And when they encountered something truly dangerous, something that threatened to overwhelm even their formidable strength, they did not throw their lives away in pointless defiance. They remembered. They learned. And sometimes they withdrew. This is the first thing you must understand about the Vikings. Their fear was not a flaw. It was part of what made them so successful. They respected the forces of the world, natural and human, and that respect kept them alive. Let us speak now of the sea. For the sea was everything to the Norse, their highway, their hunting ground, their pathway to the wider world. The coastline of Scandinavia is impossibly long. If you were to stretch it out straight, counting every fjord and inlet and island, it would reach for tens of thousands of miles. The Norse grew up with the sea at their doorstep. The sound of waves was the backdrop of their lives. The smell of salt was in their clothes, their hair, their skin. They became, quite simply, the greatest sailors of their age. Perhaps of any age. Their ships were marvels of engineering, light and flexible, able to bend with the waves rather than fight against them. The hulls were built from overlapping planks of oak, nailed together and sealed with tarred wool. A single mast carried a great square sail, usually made of wool dyed in bright colors. Red and white were common, and when the wind was right, a long ship could fly across the water at speeds no other vessel could match. But the truly revolutionary feature was the shallow draft. A Viking longship needed only a few feet of water to float. This meant they could sail up rivers that would ground any other ship. They could beach directly on shores, leap out, conduct their raid, and be gone before any defense could be mounted. They could appear anywhere, with almost no warning. This was the source of their power. This was why the monasteries of Britain and the towns of Francia learned to dread the sight of a square sail on the horizon. But the sea that gave them so much also demanded a price. The North Atlantic is one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. Storms can rise with terrifying speed, the sky darkening, the wind screaming, the waves building into mountains of black water that can swallow a ship whole. Even in calmer weather, the currents are treacherous, the fog is thick, and the cold is deadly. A man who fell overboard in those waters would survive on. And so the sea was both their greatest ally and their most constant fear. They respected it as they respected the gods themselves, perhaps more, for the sea was always present, always watching, always ready to claim the unwary. Now let us turn to the wider shape of their world, the geography that would define their age of expansion. Scandinavia, for all its beauty, was limited. The farmland was scarce. The population was growing. By the late 8th century, there were simply too many people competing for too few resources. Younger sons, who would not inherit their fathers' farms, needed somewhere to go. Ambitious chieftains needed wealth to reward their followers. The pressure was building, year by year, generation by generation. And then they looked outward. To the west lay the islands of Britain and Ireland, rich, green, poorly defended. The monasteries there were filled with gold and silver, accumulated over centuries of pious donations. The monks who guarded these treasures were men of peace, utterly unprepared for violence. To the south lay the continent of Europe, the crumbling remnants of the Carolingian Empire, torn by civil wars, its coasts unguarded. The trading towns along the rivers were wealthy and vulnerable. To the east lay the vast interior of what would become Russia, endless forests, great rivers, and beyond them, the legendary markets of Constantinople and Baghdad, where a man could trade furs and slaves for silver and silk. The Vikings saw all of this. They saw opportunity. And beginning in the year 793, with the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne, they began to take it. And some, a rare and remarkable few, would become the stuff of Viking nightmares. The names whispered around the hearth fires on long winter nights. The warnings passed from father to son. The peoples that even the bravest Norse warrior did not wish to face. In the parts that follow, we will meet these peoples one by one. We will walk the fortified bridges of the Frankish kingdoms, where Charlemagne's heirs learned to turn back the longships. We will stand with Alfred the Great in the marshes of Somerset, as he rebuilt his shattered kingdom into something the Vikings could not break. We will venture into the misty hills of Ireland, where warrior kings refused to kneel. We will shiver in the frozen forests of Finland, where shamans worked magic that chilled even Norse blood. We will sail with the Vikings to the walls of Constantinople, where Greek fire burned their ships to ashes. We will meet the Moors of Iberia, the Slavic tribes of the east, and the mysterious Skraelings of a distant western land. But all of that lies ahead. For now, let us rest here, on the shores of Scandinavia, in a land of ice and fire. The night is deep. The stars are turning slowly overhead. Somewhere, a wolf howls in the mountains, a long, lonely sound that fades into silence. In the longhouses, the fires are burning low. Families are sleeping, wrapped in furs, dreaming of the summer to come. And out on the dark water of the fjord, a single longship rocks gently at anchor, its dragon prow gazing out toward the unknown. The Vikings are dreaming too. Dreaming of glory. Dreaming of silver. Dreaming of the wide world that awaits them. But in their dreams, there are also shadows. Shadows of the enemies they have not yet met. Shadows of the defeats they cannot imagine. Shadows of the fears they will carry with them to the ends of the earth. Rest now. Let yourself drift. The story will continue when you are ready. In the next part, we will travel south and west, to the heart of the Carolingian Empire. We will meet the Franks, the first people to truly challenge Viking power in Europe. We will see how fortified bridges and armored cavalry turned the tide of battle, and why the very name of Charlemagne echoed through Norse sagas for. Let yourself settle a little deeper now. The first part of our journey is complete, and we have left the fjords of Scandinavia behind, at least for a time. The longships are sailing south and west, carried by fair winds across the grey waters of the North Sea. And ahead of them lies a land of green fields and winding rivers, of stone churches and wealthy towns. This is Francia, the heart of the old Carolingian Empire, the realm that Charlemagne himself once ruled. And it is here, in this fertile and prosperous land, that the Vikings would meet their first true challenge. Here they would learn that not all of Europe would bend before them. Here they would encounter warriors and kings who refused to be victims, who studied the Norse tactics, adapted to them, and eventually turned the tide. Breathe slowly. Let the tension leave your body. We are in no hurry. The story will unfold like a river, gentle and steady, carrying you along. Let us begin by understanding what the Franks were, and why they mattered. The Frankish kingdom was the most powerful state in Western Europe during the early medieval period. It had risen from the chaos that followed the fall of Rome, uniting much of what is now France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern Italy under a single crown. At its height, under the great Emperor Charlemagne, Charles the Great, it was the largest and most organized realm the West had seen in centuries. Charlemagne died in 814, just 2 decades after the first Viking raids began. But the empire he built endured, though it was divided among his grandsons and weakened by civil wars. And it was this empire, fragmented but still formidable, that the Vikings now sought to plunder. At first, the raids were devastating. The Vikings came without warning, their shallow-drafted ships sliding up the rivers that the Franks had always considered safe highways of trade. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, these great waterways became pathways of terror. The longships could sail hundreds of miles inland, striking at towns and monasteries that had never imagined such an attack was possible. The Frankish response, in those early years, was confusion and despair. The traditional Frankish army was built around heavy cavalry, armored knights on powerful horses, devastating in open battle. But the Vikings refused to give open battle. They struck and vanished. They retreated to their ships before the slow-moving Frankish forces could arrive. They chose islands and coastal camps as their bases, places where cavalry could not reach them. It seemed, for a time, that there was no answer. The monasteries burned. The silver flowed north to Scandinavia. The people of Francia lived in fear, and some began to wonder if God himself had abandoned them. But the Franks were not a people easily broken. They had built an empire through war and will, and they would not surrender it without a fight. The first great adaptation came in the form of fortifications. The Frankish kings and their local lords began to build, not just castles, but a new kind of defensive structure designed specifically to counter the Viking threat. They built fortified bridges. Picture this, if you will, a great river, wide and slow, the kind of waterway a Viking fleet could sail with ease. Now imagine a bridge stretched across it, not a simple wooden crossing, but a massive structure of stone and timber, with towers at each end and a fortified gatehouse in the middle. The bridge is too low for a longship's mast to pass beneath. The towers are manned by archers and soldiers. The gatehouse controls access to the river beyond. These bridges changed everything. Suddenly, the Vikings could not sail where they pleased. Their greatest advantage, their mobility, their ability to appear anywhere, was neutralized. They could attack the bridges, of course, but that meant fighting on Frankish terms, against prepared defenses. And while the Vikings were fearsome warriors, they were not siege engineers. They had no tradition of assaulting fortifications. Their tactics were built around speed and surprise, not grinding attrition. The first and most famous of these bridges was built at Pont de l'Arche, on the Seine, in the 860s. It was the work of Charles the Bald, Charlemagne's grandson, a king who had suffered terribly from Viking raids and was determined to find a solution. The bridge took years to complete, and it was not perfect. The Vikings eventually found ways around it, but it proved the concept. It showed that the Norse could be stopped. Other bridges followed. Other fortifications rose along the rivers and coasts. The landscape of Francia began to bristle with defenses, and the easy days of raiding were coming to an end. But the bridges were only part of the story. The Franks also learned to fight. In the early raids, the Frankish cavalry had been nearly useless. By the time the knights assembled and rode to the site of an attack, the Vikings were long gone. But over the decades, the Franks adapted. They stationed permanent garrisons in vulnerable areas. They developed networks of watchtowers and signal fires to give early warning of approaching ships. They learned to anticipate where the Vikings would strike and to have forces ready to meet them. And when battle was finally joined, the Frankish heavy cavalry proved devastating. The Vikings were superb infantry fighters. Their shield wall was a formidable formation, and in close combat, their axes and swords were brutally effective. But they had few horses and little cavalry tradition. When caught in the open by Frankish knights, heavy men on heavy horses, charging at full gallop with couched lances, the results were often catastrophic. The Norse learned to fear that thunder of hooves. They learned to avoid open ground, to stay close to their ships, to never stray too far from the safety of the water. The arrogance of the early raids began to fade, replaced by a wary respect for Frankish military power. There is a story, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, of a great Viking chieftain who led his men deep into Francia, confident in their strength. They had raided many towns and gathered much plunder. But as they marched back toward their ships, they found their path blocked by a Frankish army, knights in shining mail, infantry with long spears, archers on the flanks. The chieftain looked at his men. They were tired from the march, burdened with loot far from the sea. He looked at the Franks, fresh and ready, their horses stamping with eagerness. And he ordered a retreat. Not a fighting retreat, but a full withdrawal, abandoning much of the plunder, fleeing for the ships as fast as they could go. His men grumbled. Some called him a coward. But the chieftain knew what would happen if they stood and fought. He had seen it before, the way the Frankish charge shattered a shield wall, the way men were trampled beneath iron hooves. He would not throw his warriors' lives away for silver. They reached the ships. They sailed home. And the chieftain lived to raid another day, older, wiser, and far more cautious. Now let us speak of one more aspect of the Frankish response, one that was perhaps less glorious, but no less effective. The Franks learned to pay. It sounds like weakness, and in a sense it was. The payment of tribute to the Vikings, what the English would later call Danegeld, became a common practice throughout Francia. When a Viking army appeared at the gates of a city or camped on an island in the river, the local lord or bishop would often negotiate a payment. Silver, gold, wine, grain, whatever the Norse demanded, in exchange for peace. The Vikings, for their part, were usually happy to accept. They were practical people. If they could get what they wanted without fighting, so much the better. Fighting meant risk, meant wounds, meant the chance of death far from home. Payment meant profit without cost. But the tribute was not simply surrender. It was time. Time for the Franks to build their bridges. Time to train their cavalry. Time to strengthen their defenses. Each payment bought a respite, and each respite was used to prepare for the next attack. And over the decades, the balance shifted. The raids became harder. The losses became greater. The Vikings began to realize that Francia was no longer the easy target it had once been. By the late 9th century, the great Viking armies that had once roamed freely across the Frankish lands were meeting serious resistance. Some were defeated in battle. Others were bought off with increasingly desperate payments, but found that the next season brought even stronger defenses. And some, a growing number, began to wonder if there might be easier prey elsewhere. The Frankish resistance was not a single dramatic victory. There was no one battle that ended the Viking threat, no one hero who drove them back into the sea. It was a slow, grinding process, decades of adaptation, of learning, of building. But it worked. But that is a story for another time. For now, let us rest with this knowledge. The Franks were the first to truly challenge the Vikings, and the first to find ways to stop them. They did not do it through superior courage or divine favor. They did it through intelligence, adaptation, and relentless effort. They built walls when walls were needed. They trained cavalry when cavalry was needed. They paid tribute when tribute bought them time. And in the end, they transformed their most dangerous enemies into subjects and neighbors. The Vikings learned from this. They learned that not every land would yield to them. They learned that some peoples would fight back, would study their tactics, find their weaknesses, and exploit them without mercy. And they carried this lesson with them as they sailed to other shores. In Britain, they would encounter another king who refused to break, a man who would become legend, who would rebuild a shattered kingdom and hold the line against the Norse tide. His name was Alfred, and the English would call him great. But that story, like all the stories that remain, will wait for you. The night is deep. The fire is low. somewhere in the distance, you can almost hear the slow rhythm of oars and water, the creak of timber, the whisper of wind in a woolen sail. Let yourself drift. Let the world grow soft and quiet. The Franks are watching their bridges, their torches flickering in the darkness. The Vikings are sailing home, their holds heavy with silver, their minds heavy with something new, something like respect. And you are here, safe and warm, carried along by the gentle current of history. Rest now. The next part of our journey awaits. Within a few years, the great heathen army had conquered most of England. The kingdom of Northumbria fell. East Anglia fell. Mercia, the great power of the English Midlands, was reduced to a shadow of itself. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms crumbled before the Viking onslaught. By the year 871, only one kingdom remained unconquered. Only one king still stood against the Norse tide. His name was Alfred. He was just 22 years old when he came to the throne of Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, in the south of England. He was the youngest of 5 brothers, never expected to rule. He had been a sickly child, prone to mysterious ailments that would plague him all his life. He was more interested in books and learning than in war. He seemed, in every way, an unlikely hero. But Alfred had one quality that would prove more valuable than strength, or health, or military experience. He had an unbreakable will. A determination that simply refused to yield, no matter how dark the circumstances became. And the circumstances were about to become very dark indeed. The Vikings tested Alfred from the very beginning of his reign. In 871 alone, he fought 9 major battles against them, winning some, losing others, but never surrendering, never making the kind of peace that would leave his kingdom in Norse hands. He paid tribute when he had to, buying time to rebuild his forces. He retreated when retreat was necessary. But he always came back. For 7 years, this desperate struggle continued. Alfred held on, sometimes by the barest of margins, while around him the other English kingdoms fell into Viking hands. The Danes, as the English often called the Norse invaders, established their own territories across the north and east of England, a region that would come to be known as the Danelaw. And then, in the winter of 878, the final blow fell. The Viking king Guthrum launched a surprise attack in the dead of winter, a time when armies did not march, when kings stayed safe in their halls, when no one expected war. He struck at Chippenham, where Alfred was celebrating the Christmas feast, and the Saxon defenses shattered. Alfred fled. There is no other word for it. He fled into the wilderness with a handful of loyal followers, his kingdom in ruins, his army scattered, his people under the Viking heel. For weeks, perhaps months, Alfred hid in the marshes and forests of Somerset, that strange, waterlogged country in the southwest of England, where the land becomes a maze of wetlands and islands and hidden paths. He lived like an outlaw, hunted and desperate, with nothing but his faith and his stubbornness to sustain him. There is a famous legend from this time, the story of Alfred and the cakes. It is said that he took shelter in the hut of a peasant woman who did not recognize her king. She asked him to watch the cakes, small loaves of bread, baking on the fire while she went about her work. But Alfred, lost in thought, brooding on his troubles, let the cakes burn. The woman scolded him fiercely for his carelessness. The story may not be true. It first appears in sources written long after Alfred's death. But it endures because it captures something essential about this moment. The image of the great king brought so low that he is scolded by a peasant, his mind so burdened with care that he cannot perform the simplest task. This was Alfred's darkest hour. And yet, somehow, in that darkness, he found something. He found his resolve. Through the early months of 878, Alfred began to rebuild. He sent messengers to the loyal thanes, the Saxon nobles, who still held out in scattered pockets across Wessex. He gathered information about the Viking positions. He made alliances with local leaders who knew the hidden ways of the marshes. And in May of that year, he emerged from the wilderness. The summons went out across Wessex. The king was alive. The king was calling his people to war. And the people answered. They gathered at a place called Egbert Stone, on the edge of Selwood Forest, an ancient landmark where three shires met. And when Alfred saw them coming, streaming in from every direction, he must have felt something like hope for the first time in months. They marched to meet Guthrum's army at a place called Edington. And there, on that blood-soaked hillside, they fought the battle that would decide the fate of England. The details of the Battle of Edington are lost to us. The sources give only the barest outline, that Alfred led his men in a great shield wall, that the fighting was fierce and prolonged, that at last the Vikings broke and fled. But the result was clear. Alfred had won. Not just a battle, but a turning point. Guthrum and his surviving warriors retreated to their fortress, and Alfred besieged them there for 2 weeks until hunger forced them to surrender. The peace that followed was remarkable. Guthrum agreed to convert to Christianity, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather at the baptism. The Vikings would keep the lands they had already conquered in the north and east, the Danelaw, but Wessex would remain free. For the first time, a Viking army had been stopped. Not just raided against, not just survived, but genuinely defeated and forced to make peace on Saxon terms. Alfred had achieved what no other English king had managed. But he knew, he understood in his bones, that this was not the end. The Vikings would come again. They always came aga. He created a network of fortified towns, the Bez. These were not castles in the later medieval sense, but defended settlements, strategically placed so that no part of Wessex was more than a day's march from safety. Each had permanent walls, permanent garrisons, and a population large enough to man the defenses in times of crisis. This system was revolutionary. It meant that when the Vikings came, and they would come, there would be no more easy targets. Every town would be a fortress. Every fortress would buy time for the army to gather. Alfred reorganized that army, too. He divided his fighting men into 2 groups, which would rotate between service and farming. At any given time, half the army would be in the field while the other half tended the crops at home. This meant Alfred could keep forces mobilized for extended campaigns without destroying the agricultural economy. He built a navy, something the English had never seriously attempted before. If the Vikings ruled the seas, then the English would challenge them there. Alfred's ships were larger than the longships, heavier and less maneuverable, but they could carry more men and fight effectively in coastal waters. For the first time, the Vikings could be intercepted before they ever reached the shore. And Alfred did something else, something that might seem small, but that speaks to his vision for his kingdom. He promoted learning. He gathered scholars from across Europe, established schools, translated important books from Latin into the English language. He believed that a kingdom's strength came not only from its walls and armies, but from the wisdom and education of its people. He wanted his people to be able to read. He wanted them to know their own history. He wanted them to understand why they fought, and what they fought for. This was the king the Vikings had tried to destroy in that dark winter of 878. This was the man who rose from the marshes and built something that would owe you. The Vikings remembered Alfred. They told stories about him in their own lands, the Saxon king who would not break, who rose from defeat and turned the tide. He became, in a strange way, one of the people they respected. Not because they loved him, but because they understood him. He was a warrior. He was a survivor. He was someone who faced impossible odds and refused to yield. Those were qualities the Norse understood very well indeed. And so Alfred the Great, for that is what the English would call him, the only English king ever to bear that title, became one of the shadows in the Viking mind. One of the reminders that the world beyond Scandinavia was not filled with helpless victims. Some peoples would fight. Some peoples would learn. Some peoples would build walls and train armies and refuse, absolutely refuse, to surrender. The Vikings were still fearsome. They were still dangerous. But after Alfred, after the buzz and the ships and the reorganized armies, they knew that England would never be an easy conquest. They would keep coming, of course. The struggle would continue for generations. But the tide had turned. The balance had shifted. And the seeds of England, a unified kingdom that would one day rule the seas itself, had been planted in the ashes of those dark winter months. Rest now. Let the image of Alfred fade softly into the darkness. the weary king on his walls, watching over his people, the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The next part of our journey will take us across the Irish Sea, to a land of green hills and ancient stone, where warrior kings fought the Vikings with a fury that matched their own. We will meet Brian Boru and the fierce resistance of the Irish. But that story will wait. All the stories will wait. For now, there is only the quiet, the gentle rhythm of your breath, the soft weight of sleep beginning to gather at the edges of your mind. Let it come. Let it carry you. You are safe here. Let yourself drift now across dark waters. We are leaving the shores of England behind, sailing westward into the Irish Sea. The waves are gentle tonight, rocking us softly, and ahead lies an island wrapped in mist and mystery. This is Ireland, the Emerald Isle. A land of green valleys and grey stone, of ancient monasteries and warrior clans, of poets and saints and kings who answered to no one. The Vikings came to Ireland just as they came to everywhere else, with fire and sword, with dragon-prowed ships appearing from the morning fog. They burned monasteries. They carried off treasures. They took slaves by the thousands, shipping them back to the markets of Scandinavia and beyond. But Ireland was different from the other lands the Vikings raided. It was not a single kingdom that could be conquered in one great campaign. It was a patchwork of dozens of small kingdoms, each ruled by its own king, each locked in endless rivalries with its neighbors. There was no central authority to destroy, no capital to capture, no single leader whose defeat would mean the submission of the whole island. And the Irish, the proud, stubborn, fierce Irish, refused to kneel. Breathe slowly now. Let the rhythm of the waves carry you deeper into rest. The story unfolds gently, like moonlight spreading across still water. The first recorded Viking raid on Ireland came in 795, just 2 years after Lindisfarne. The target was the island of Rathlin, off the northeastern coast, and the monastery of Ricra. The pattern was familiar: sudden attack, burning, looting, and a swift retreat to the sea before any defense could be organized. For the next few decades, this pattern continued. The Vikings raided the coasts, struck at the wealthy monasteries, and vanished before the Irish kings could respond. The monasteries were tempting targets. They held centuries of accumulated treasure, golden chalices and jeweled book covers and silver reliquaries. And the monks, men of peace, offered little resistance. But the monasteries were not undefended forever. The Irish learned. Just as the Franks had learned, just as Alfred had learned, the Irish adapted to the Viking threat. They built round towers, those distinctive stone structures that still dot the Irish landscape today, tall and narrow, with doors set high above the ground. When the Vikings came, the monks could retreat into these towers, pulling up ladders behind them, waiting out the raid in relative safety. And the Irish kings began to fight back. Unlike England, where the kingdoms gradually fell to Viking conquest, Ireland remained fragmented, and that fragmentation, strangely, became a kind of strength. There was no single army for the Vikings to destroy, no single king whose defeat would end all resistance. Instead, there were dozens of kings, dozens of armies, dozens of proud warrior lords who would rather die than submit to foreign rule. The Vikings could win a battle against one king, only to find another rising against them the next season. They could establish a foothold in one region, only to face constant harassment from the surrounding territories. They could build settlements and trading posts. They founded Dublin itself, and Waterford, and Limerick, but they could never fully pacify the countryside around them. The fighting was brutal on both sides. The Irish and the Vikings were well matched in ferocity. Both cultures valued warrior courage above almost all else. Both had traditions of cattle raiding and blood feud that made violence a part of daily life. When they clashed, either side asked for quarter or expected mercy. The Irish fought with weapons suited to their style of warfare: light spears and javelins, swords for close combat, and the terrifying Irish axe, a weapon that could split a Viking's shield with a single blow. They used the landscape to their advantage, ambushing Viking columns in narrow valleys, attacking from concealment in the forests and bogs. And they had one advantage the Vikings had not expected: They were willing to fight each other as allies of the Norse, but they were equally willing to turn against the Vikings when it suited them. The politics of Ireland in this era were dizzyingly complex. Viking leaders made alliances with Irish kings. Irish kings hired Viking mercenaries. Brothers fought brothers, and yesterday's enemy became today's friend. The Vikings, for all their military prowess, found themselves entangled in a web of feuds and rivalries they barely understood. Sometimes they were the hunters. Sometimes they were the prey. One story from this period captures the nature of Irish resistance. In 848, a Viking army ravaged the lands of Munster, in the south of Ireland. They had been raiding with impunity for months, growing careless with success. Then they encountered Alcabar mac Sinita, king of a small Irish kingdom called the Iganachta. Alcabar gathered his warriors and met the Vikings in battle. The Irish victory was so complete, the slaughter so thorough, that the annals recorded it as one of the greatest defeats the Norse had ever suffered in Ireland. The survivors fled to their ships, and for years afterward, the Vikings were more cautious in the lands of Munster. But Alcabar was just one king among many. Brian Boru, in Irish, Brian Baruma, was born around 941, into the Dalgekis, a relatively minor clan in what is now County Clare. His early life was shaped by violence. The Vikings of Limerick raided constantly, and Brian's own mother was killed in one of their attacks. He grew up with hatred in his heart, and steel in his hand. But Brian was not simply a warrior. He was something rarer, a strategist, a politician, a man who could see beyond the next battle to the shape of things to come. He began by uniting his own clan under his leadership. Then he expanded, absorbing neighboring territories through a combination of military victory and shrewd diplomacy. He defeated the Vikings of Limerick in a series of campaigns, breaking their power in the Shannon region. He turned their own tactics against them, raiding their settlements, burning their ships, cutting off their trade routes. By the 980s, Brian was the most powerful king in Munster. But he did not stop there. He looked north, to the rich lands of Leinster and Meath. He looked east, to Dublin, the greatest Viking city in Ireland. And he saw what no Irish king had seen before, the possibility of ruling the entire island. This was an audacious vision. Ireland had never been united under a single High King in anything more than name. The title of High King existed, but it was largely ceremonial, a recognition of the most powerful king of the moment rather than true sovereignty. The High King could demand tribute and hostages from lesser kings, but he could not command their armies or rule their lands directly. Brian intended to change that. Through decades of war and diplomacy, he built a coalition that stretched across Ireland. He defeated rival kings in battle, then offered them generous terms, submit to his authority, and they could keep their lands and their titles. Resist, and they would be destroyed. But peace, in Ireland, never lasted long. The old rivalries simmered beneath the surface. The kings who had submitted to Brian resented his authority. The Vikings of Dublin chafed under Irish rule. And Brian's enemies began to plot. The leader of the rebellion was Mael Morda, king of Leinster, a proud and bitter man who had long resented Brian's supremacy. He made common cause with Sitric Silkenbeard, the Viking king of Dublin, and together they reached out to the wider Norse world for aid. Ships came from the Orkney Islands, from the Isle of Man, from the Viking settlements of Britain. Warriors came seeking glory and plunder, drawn by the promise of battle against the most famous king in Ireland. The two forces met on Good Friday, April 23, 1014, at a place called Clontarf, just north of Dublin, on the shores of the Irish Sea. The Battle of Clontarf was one of the bloodiest days in Irish history. Thousands of men clashed from morning until evening, the fighting so close and desperate that the bodies piled in heaps. The Viking allies attacked in waves, their axes rising and falling, their war cries echoing across the strand. The Irish held firm, their own axes answering blow for blow. By the end of the day, Brian's forces had won. The Viking-Leinster alliance was shattered. Mael Morda lay dead on the field. The Norse jarls who had come seeking glory found only graves. But Brian did not see his victory. He was an old man by then, over 70, too frail to fight in the battle himself. He had remained in his tent, praying, while his sons and grandsons led the army. And as the fighting wound down, as the last of the enemy fled toward their ships, a group of fleeing Vikings stumbled upon the High King's tent. They found him there, alone but for a few attendants, and they killed him. The Battle of Clontarf is sometimes called the end of the Viking Age in Ireland, but that is not quite true. The Vikings did not vanish overnight. Dublin remained a Norse city for generations afterward, and Viking influence would linger in Irish culture for centuries. But something had changed. The great dream of Viking conquest, of ruling Ireland as they ruled so much of England, was over. The Irish had proven, conclusively and bloodily, that they would not be subjugated. The cost had been terrible, but the message was clear. Ireland would remain Irish. The Vikings who stayed became part of Ireland, intermarrying with the native population, adopting Irish customs and language, gradually blending into the fabric of Irish society. The Vikings who left carried with them the memory of a land that had never yielded, a people who had fought them to a standstill for over 200 years. Brian Boru became a legend, the great king who united Ireland, who broke the power of the foreigners, who died at the moment of his greatest victory. His story was told and retold, embellished and mythologized, until he became almost a figure of fable. But beneath the legend was a truth that the Vikings understood very well. Some peoples could not be conquered. Some lands demanded too high a price. Some enemies, stubborn, proud, endlessly resilient, would simply never stop fighting. The Irish were such a people, and the Vikings, for all their courage and ferocity, learned to respect them. Rest now. Let the green hills of Ireland fade softly into mist. The battle is over. The warriors are sleeping at last. In the next part of our journey, we will travel further still, north, into the cold and misty lands of Scotland, where the mysterious Picts painted their bodies with strange symbols and fought with a ferocity that gave even the Norsemen pause. But that story waits. All the stories wait. For now, there is only the quiet, the gentle breath of the sea. Let yourself drift northward now, carried on currents of cool air and quiet imagination. We are leaving Ireland behind, crossing the narrow waters between that green island and another, a land of mountains and lochs, of heather-covered moors and ancient standing stones. This is Scotland. Or rather, this is the land that would become Scotland. In the age we are visiting tonight, it had no single name, for it was not yet a single kingdom. It was a place of many peoples, Scots and Britons, Angles and Norse. And oldest of all, most mysterious of all, the Picts. The Picts. Even the name carries a whisper of enigma. It comes from the Latin word picti, the painted ones. The Romans gave them this name, for the Picts decorated their bodies with elaborate tattoos and painted designs, swirling patterns of blue and black that made them appear otherworldly, terrifying, not quite human. Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders relax. We are in no hurry tonight. The mist is settling over the mountains, soft and silver, and the story will unfold like a dream. The Picts had lived in the northern reaches of Britain for centuries, perhaps for millennia. Their origins are lost in the fog of prehistory. They spoke a language that has almost entirely vanished, leaving behind only place names and a handful of inscriptions that scholars still struggle to decipher. They carved magnificent stone monuments covered with symbols whose meanings remain mysterious: crescents and double discs, serpents and eagles, mirrors and combs. They were, in many ways, a people apart. Even to their neighbors, the Picts seemed strange and ancient, a remnant of an older world. But there was nothing weak about them. The Picts had held their lands against the might of Rome itself. The Emperor Hadrian built his famous wall in part to keep them out. Later, the Emperor Antoninus built another wall even further north, and still the Picts raided and harassed the Roman frontier. When Rome finally withdrew from Britain, the Picts remained, unconquered, unbowed, as fierce as they had ever been. This was the people the Vikings encountered when they sailed into Scottish waters. The Norse first came to Scotland as raiders, just as they came to everywhere else. The northern and western coasts were tempting targets, scattered settlements, wealthy monasteries, and crucially, the sea routes that led around Britain to Ireland and beyond. The Vikings established footholds in the Orkney Islands, the Shetlands, the Hebrides. These island chains became Norse territories, staging grounds for further raids and settlements. But when they pushed into the mainland, into the heartland of Pictish territory, they found something unexpected. They found resistance. Now let us speak of something else, something that added another layer to the Viking fear of the Picts. The Norse were a superstitious people. They believed in a world filled with spirits and omens, with magic both helpful and harmful. Their own seers and Valvas commanded great respect, for they could read the future in runes and entrails, could call upon the power of the gods, could curse enemies with words alone. But the Picts, in Norse eyes, were something stranger still. The Pictish religion is poorly understood today. They seem to have worshipped nature spirits and ancestral powers, to have held certain animals sacred, to have practiced rituals at standing stones and sacred pools. Their priests, or druids, as they are sometimes called, though the term is imprecise, were figures of great power and mystery. To the Vikings, this was dark magic. The Pictish sorcerers could call down storms, could curse a man so that his wounds would never heal, could summon spirits from the lochs and mountains to harry an invading army. At least, that was what the Norse believed. How much of this was true? Probably very little, in any literal sense. But belief is a powerful thing. When a Viking warrior marched into Pictish territory, he was not just facing spears and axes. He was facing the unknown, a land of ancient power, inhabited by painted demons who spoke an incomprehensible tongue and worshipped gods whose very names were secrets. Some modern scholars believe that the Picts deliberately cultivated this aura of mystery. The tattoos, the strange symbols, the secretive rituals, all of these served to intimidate enemies, to make the Picts appear more powerful and more dangerous than their numbers alone would suggest. If so, it worked. There is a story, half legend, half history, of a Viking jarl who led a great expedition into Pictish territory. He was a bold man, contemptuous of the painted savages who dared to resist Norse might. He boasted that he would burn their sacred groves, topple their standing stones, and take their king's head as a trophy. He marched inland with 100 warriors, the cream of his forces. They followed a river valley into the mountains, expecting to find the Pictish capital and sack it before the defenders could organize. They never returned. Weeks later, a handful of survivors staggered back to the coast, gaunt, starving, driven half-mad by what they had experienced. They spoke of ambushes in the night, of warriors who appeared from nowhere and vanished like ghosts, of strange lights in the sky and sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Jarl was dead. Most of his men were dead. And those who survived refused, ever after, to speak of what they had seen in the mountains. Is the story true? It is impossible to say. The sagas are filled with exaggeration and myth-making. But the pattern it describes, the pattern of Viking expeditions that ventured too far into Pictish lands and never came back, appears again and again in the fragmentary records of the era. The Picts were a wall. Not a wall of stone or wood, but a wall of courage and cunning and ancient, terrible mystery. The Vikings broke against that wall and finally, wisely, stopped trying to breach it. But what the Picts had defended, their land, their freedom, their identity, lived on. The kingdom that emerged from the merger of Picts and Scots would become Scotland, and Scotland would remain one of the few corners of the British Isles that the Vikings never fully conquered. The Vikings who settled in Scotland, and many did, in the islands and along the coasts, eventually made their peace with this reality. They intermarried with the local population. They adopted local customs. They became, over generations, something new, Norse Gaelic hybrids whose descendants would shape Scottish history for centuries to come. But they never forgot the Picts. In their sagas and their stories, the painted warriors of the north remained figures of awe and terror. They were the people who could not be conquered. The people who fought like demons and vanished like smoke. The people whose land was protected by powers older than the gods themselves. And in the quiet corners of their hearts, even the bravest Vikings wondered what would have happened if they had pressed harder, marched further, challenged the Picts in their mountain strongholds. Perhaps it was better not to know. Rest now. Let the mist settle soft and silver over the mountains. The Picts are sleeping in their hill-fort halls, their enemies turned back, their secrets safe for another night. In the next part of our journey, we will travel further still, south and west, to the green valleys of Wales, where another stubborn people held their mountains against all comers. The Welsh princes fought the Vikings with the same fierce determination they would later show against the Normans and the English, and their rugged land proved as formidable a fortress as any wall of stone. But that story waits. All the stories wait. For now, there is only the quiet. The soft cry of an eagle circling far overhead. The gentle sound of wind in the heather. The ancient standing stones, keeping their eternal vigil over a land that has never truly been conquered. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come like the mist, soft and slow and gentle. You are safe here, in this place of mystery and peace. And the story will be here when you return. Let yourself drift southward now, following the western coast of Britain. The Scottish mountains are fading behind us, and ahead lies another land of hills and valleys, of ancient fortresses and proud princes. A land that has been called by many names over the centuries, but which we know today as Wales. The Welsh called themselves the Cymry, the compatriots, the people of the land. They were the descendants of the ancient Britons, the Celtic people who had inhabited these islands long before the Romans came, long before the Saxons, long before anyone else. They had been pushed westward over the centuries, driven into the mountains by wave after wave of invaders. But they had never been conquered. They had never surrendered. And when the Vikings came, the Welsh were ready. Breathe slowly now. Let your body sink deeper into rest. The mountains of Wales rise soft and purple in the evening light, and the story unfolds like a path winding through a quiet valley. Wales was, and still is, a land defined by its geography. The mountains that make up its spine are not as tall as the Alps or even the Scottish Highlands, but they are relentlessly rugged. Ridge after ridge of steep hills, cut by narrow valleys, blanketed in forest and bracken and treacherous bog. The paths through this landscape are few and difficult. An army that did not know the way could wander for days, growing weaker and more vulnerable with every step. This was the fortress that protected the Welsh. Not walls of stone, though they had those too, but the land itself. The Vikings discovered this early in their raids on Britain. Wales sat tantalizingly close to their bases in Ireland and the Irish Sea Islands. The coastline was accessible, dotted with monasteries and trading settlements that promised easy plunder. But every time the Norse pushed inland, they found themselves swallowed by the mountains. The Welsh knew every path, every ford, every hidden valley where an ambush could be laid. They practiced a style of warfare perfectly suited to their terrain, swift raids and sudden retreats, harassing attacks that wore down an enemy's strength without ever offering a pitched battle. They would strike a Viking column as it struggled through a mountain pass, kill a dozen men, and vanish into the hills before reinforcements could arrive. Then they would do it again, and again, and again. One of the most remarkable of these princes was Rhodri Mar, Rhodri the Great, who ruled Gwynedd in the mid-9th century. Through a combination of inheritance, marriage, and conquest, Rhodri united much of Wales under his rule. And he proved to be a scourge of the Vikings. In 856, Rhodri won a great victory against a Viking force led by a chieftain named Gorm. The battle was celebrated across the Celtic world. Here was a prince who could not only resist the Northmen but defeat them decisively. Rhodri's fame spread, and he became a symbol of Welsh resistance. But Rhodri understood that one victory meant nothing in the long struggle. The Vikings would return. They always returned. And so he spent his reign strengthening his kingdom's defenses, building alliances with other Welsh princes, preparing for the battles to come. He was right to do so. The Vikings came again and again, and Rhodri fought them each time. He was eventually killed in battle, not against the Vikings, but against the English of Mercia, for the Welsh faced enemies on multiple fronts. But the kingdom he built endured, and his descendants continued his legacy of resistance. The Vikings learned to respect the Welsh. In their sagas and records, Wales appears as a land of fierce warriors and difficult terrain, a place where glory was hard to win and losses were easy to suffer. Some Norse leaders made alliances with Welsh princes, preferring to trade rather than fight. Others simply avoided Welsh waters altogether, seeking easier prey elsewhere. There is a quality to Welsh resistance that deserves special mention, for it speaks to something deeper than military tactics. The Welsh were not simply fighting for their land. They were fighting for their identity. The Welsh language, Cymraeg, was ancient even in the Viking Age. It was the language of the Britons, the original Celtic tongue of the island, and the Welsh guarded it fiercely. Their poets, the bards, were figures of enormous cultural importance. They memorized vast collections of poems and genealogies, histories and laws, passing them down from generation to generation through the spoken word. To lose Wales was not simply to lose territory. It was to lose a language, a literature, a way of seeing the world that stretched back beyond memory. The Welsh knew this, and it gave their resistance a quality of desperation that mere territorial defense could never match. They fought for their words, for their songs, for the stories told around winter fires and the poems sung in princely halls. They fought for the very sound of their own voices. And they won. Wales remained Welsh. The language survived. The culture endured. Centuries later, when the English finally conquered Wales politically, the Welsh identity persisted, stubborn, proud, unbroken. And it persists still, today, in the millions who speak Cymraeg and celebrate their heritage. The Vikings understood something of this. They were a people who valued their own skalds, their own poets, their own ancestral stories. They could recognize the same fierce cultural pride in others. And perhaps, in some way, they respected the Welsh for it. Or perhaps they simply grew tired of dying in mountain ambushes for a prize that seemed to slip forever out of reach. Whatever the reason, Wales emerged from the Viking Age largely intact. The raids diminished as the centuries passed. The Norse who had settled in nearby Ireland and the islands gradually assimilated into the local populations, becoming more Irish or Scottish than Scandinavian. The great fleets that had once terrorized the Irish Sea dispersed, their crews settling down as farmers and traders rather than raiders. And the Welsh remained in their mountains, as they had always been, as they would always be. There is a Welsh word, hiraeth, that has no perfect translation in English. It means something like longing, like homesickness, like a deep and bittersweet yearning for something lost or far away. It is the ache of exile, the pull of home, the love of a land that is part of one's very soul. The Welsh felt hiraeth for their mountains, their valleys, their misty green hills. They felt it in their bones, in their blood, in the words of their ancient songs. And it was this feeling, perhaps more than any military strategy, that made them unconquerable. The Vikings could burn towns and carry off treasure. They could kill warriors and enslave the unfortunate. But they could not take hiraeth. They could not conquer what lived in the heart. Rest now. Let the mountains fade into soft blue shadows. The bard's song is ending, the fire burning low, the hall growing quiet as the listeners drift toward sleep. In the next part of our journey, we will travel eastward, across vast forests and endless plains, to meet the Slavic tribes who guarded the rivers and woodlands of Eastern Europe. These fierce peoples, the Wends, the Poles, the ancestors of a dozen modern nations, fought the Vikings with a determination that matched anything we have seen so far. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come like the mist that gathers in the valleys, soft and slow and all-encompassing. You are safe here, in this ancient place, where the mountains keep watch and the songs never quite end. Let yourself drift eastward now, across the gray waters of the Baltic Sea, toward a land that stretches farther than the eye can see. A land of endless forests and winding rivers, of marshes that swallow armies and winters that freeze the very soul. This is the realm of the Slavic tribes, a world the Vikings knew well, for they sailed its rivers and traded in its markets, but never truly conquered. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow heavy and warm. The forest is deep and dark around us, but there is nothing to fear. The fire crackles softly, and the story unfolds like a path through ancient trees. The Slavic peoples were not one nation but many, Dozens of tribes scattered across the vast plains and woodlands of Eastern Europe. The Wends along the Baltic coast, the Poles in the heartland, the Czechs and Moravians to the south, and further east still, the ancestors of the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, living in settlements along the great rivers that flowed toward distant seas. These were not primitive peoples. They built fortified towns called groti, surrounded by wooden walls and earthen ramparts. They forged iron weapons and crafted beautiful jewelry. They traded furs and amber and slaves across networks that stretched from Scandinavia to Constantinople. They had their own gods, their own priests, their own rich traditions of poetry and law. And they were fighters. Every one of them. The Vikings came to the Slavic lands for the same reasons they went everywhere else: wealth. The eastern rivers offered something the Norse valued above almost all else: a pathway to the riches of the East. By sailing up the rivers of what is now Russia, portaging their ships across short stretches of land, and sailing down again, they could reach the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And beyond those waters lay Constantinople, the greatest city in the world, and the silver markets of the Islamic caliphates. This was the famous trade route known as the Varangian Way, the road from the Baltic to Byzantium. And it passed directly through Slavic territory. The Norse who traveled this route were not primarily raiders. They were traders and adventurers, seeking profit rather than plunder. Many of them settled among the Slavic tribes, intermarrying with local women, adopting local customs, becoming something new, the Rus, a people who would eventually give their name to Russia itself. But this does not mean the relationship between Norse and Slav was peaceful. Far from it. The Slavic tribes resisted Viking expansion with fierce determination. They had no intention of becoming subjects or vassals, no matter how much silver the Northmen offered. When the Norse pushed too hard, when they tried to take by force what they could not gain by trade, the Slavs pushed back. The Wends, the Slavic tribes who lived along the southern Baltic coast, were particularly formidable enemies. They inhabited the lands that are now northern Germany and Poland, a region of dense forests, marshy coastlines, and countless islands. They were sailors themselves, building ships that could match the Norse longships in speed and maneuverability. When the Vikings raided Wendish territory, they often found the tables turned. The Wends would pursue them in their own vessels, catch them at sea, and fight with a fury that left few survivors. Wendish pirates became a terror of the Baltic in their own right, raiding Norse settlements in Denmark and Sweden with the same ruthlessness the Vikings showed elsewhere. This was something new for the Northmen. They were accustomed to being the predators, not the prey. But the Wends taught them that the eastern Baltic was not a hunting ground, it was a battleground, where the Norse were just one power among many. The chronicles of the time record countless skirmishes and battles between Vikings and Slavs. Expeditions that set out with high hopes and returned in tatters. Settlements burned and rebuilt and burned again. A constant, grinding conflict that lasted for centuries, with either side able to claim final victory. Now let us speak of the deeper reasons why the Slavs proved so difficult to conquer. First, there was the land itself. The forests of Eastern Europe were vast beyond imagination, thousands upon thousands of square miles of dense woodland, broken only by rivers and occasional clearings. An army could march for weeks without seeing open ground. And in that forest, the Slavs were masters. They knew the paths that wound between the ancient trees. They knew the fords where rivers could be crossed and the bogs where horses would sink to their bellies. They knew where to find food and shelter, where to lay ambushes and where to disappear when pursuit came too close. The Vikings were fearsome warriors in open battle. Their shield wall was nearly unbreakable, their axes devastating. But in the forest, these advantages meant little. The trees broke up formations. The undergrowth tangled feet and weapons. Visibility shrank to a few dozen yards, and every shadow might hide an enemy. The Slavs fought accordingly. They avoided pitched battles whenever possible, preferring to harass and ambush, to strike and withdraw, to wear down their enemies through 1,000 small cuts rather than one decisive blow. It was the same strategy the Picts used in Scotland, the Welsh in their mountains, the Irish in their hills. And it was devastatingly effective. Second, there was the matter of unity, or rather, the lack of it. Like the Irish and the Welsh, the Slavic tribes were fragmented into countless small kingdoms and chiefdoms. There was no single capital to capture, no single king whose defeat would mean the submission of all. Conquer one tribe, and a dozen more remained hostile. Burn one grad, and its inhabitants simply retreated deeper into the forest and built another. The friendly chieftain was overthrown or killed, and the whole bloody process had to begin again. Third, and perhaps most important, was the Slavic warrior spirit. The Slavic tribes had been fighting for their survival for as long as anyone could remember. They had faced the Huns, the Avars, the Khazars, wave after wave of steppe nomads who swept out of the east with fire and sword. They had faced pressure from the Germanic peoples to the west, the Byzantines to the south, and now the Vikings to the north. War was not an occasional disruption but a constant reality, woven into the fabric of Slavic life. This produced a society where every free man was a warrior. Boys learned to fight almost as soon as they could walk. Young men proved their worth through raids and battles. Chieftains rose and fell based on their success in war. The entire culture was oriented toward conflict, toward the endless struggle to survive in a world of enemies. The Vikings, for all their fearsome reputation, were facing a mirror image of themselves. The Slavs were just as tough, just as ruthless, just as willing to die rather than submit. And there were more of them, far more, scattered across a territory so vast that no invader could ever hope to control it all. The Norse who succeeded in the Slavic lands, the Rus who established kingdoms at Novgorod and Kiev, did so not through conquest alone but through integration. They married Slavic women. They adopted Slavic customs. They learned the Slavic languages. Within a few generations they were more Slavic than Scandinavian, their Norse origins a distant memory preserved only in the name they had given to the land. This was the price of survival in the East. You could not simply take from the Slavs. You had to become one of them. There is a lesson in this, if we care to find it. The Vikings were not unstoppable. They were not invincible. They were simply very, very good at what they did, raiding, trading, sailing, fighting. But when they encountered peoples who were equally skilled, equally determined, equally willing to pay any price for their freedom, the Norse advantage disappeared. The Slavic tribes were such a people. They bent but did not break. They absorbed the Norse who came among them, transforming them into something new. And they kept their forests, their rivers, their ancient ways, not unchanged, for nothing remains unchanged, but recognizably their own. Today, the descendants of those Slavic tribes number in the hundreds of millions. They speak languages descended from the tongues the Vikings heard in the forest clearings. They live in nations that stretch from the Baltic to the Pacific. And they carry within them the heritage of ancestors who stood against the Northmen and refused to yield. The Vikings remembered the Slavic lands as a place of danger and opportunity, of profit and peril, of enemies who could not be dismissed. The eastern forests were not a place for casual raiding. They demanded respect, caution, and ultimately, a willingness to become something other than what you had been. Many Vikings made that choice. Many more turned back, seeking easier prey in the west. And those who stayed, who married Slavic wives and raised Slavic children, left behind a legacy that shaped the future of Eastern Europe and the world. For now, there is only the quiet. The soft rustle of wind in ancient leaves. The distant cry of a wolf, lonely and wild. The deep, peaceful darkness of the forest at rest. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come like the mist that rises from the rivers, soft and slow and all-encompassing. You are safe here, in this ancient place, where the trees keep watch and the fire never quite dies. And the story will be here when you return. Let yourself drift northward now, beyond the lands of the Slavs, beyond the familiar shores of the Baltic, into a realm of endless forests and frozen lakes. A land where the winter darkness lasts for months and the summer sun never sets. A land where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural grows thin as morning ice. This is Finland. And beyond it, stretching into the Arctic itself, the homeland of the Sami, the people the Norse called the Finns, though they were distinct from the Finnish tribes who lived further south. Breathe slowly. Let your eyes grow heavy. There is magic in the air tonight, old magic, quiet magic, the kind that whispers rather than shouts. We are entering a world the Vikings feared more than almost any other. Not because of swords or armies, but because of something far more unsettling. Sorcery. The Norse were not strangers to magic. Their own culture was steeped in it. They believed in runes that could heal or harm, in seers who could glimpse the future, in the seer, a form of shamanic magic associated with the god Odin himself. Their sagas are filled with wizards and witches, curses and blessings, supernatural beings who walked among mortals and shaped their fates. But even by Norse standards, the Finns were something else. The reputation of Finnish magic spread throughout the Viking world like smoke from a distant fire. Travelers returned from the north with stories that made even hardened warriors uneasy. The Finns, they said, could control the weather. They could call down storms or calm the seas with a word. They could curse a man so that his luck turned to ash, so that his sword arm weakened, so that sickness crept into his bones no matter how far he fled. They could send their spirits out of their bodies, flying like birds across vast distances to spy on enemies or deliver messages to the dead. They could speak with animals, commanding wolves and bears and ravens to do their bidding. They could see the future in the flames of their fires, in the patterns of smoke, in the entrails of sacrificed reindeer. Most terrifying of all, they could bind the winds. The Vikings depended on the wind. Their entire way of life, raiding, trading, exploring, required them to sail across open water, often for days or weeks at a time. A favorable wind could carry a long ship from Denmark to England in a matter of days. An unfavorable wind could leave a fleet stranded, vulnerable, slowly starving as provisions ran out. And the Finns, the Norse believed, could control those winds. There are stories in the sagas of Finnish sorcerers who sold wind knots to Norse sailors. These were lengths of cord tied with 3 knots. Untie the first knot, and you would get a gentle breeze. Untie the second, and the wind would strengthen to a stiff gale. But the third knot was never to be untied, for it contained a storm that could sink any ship, no matter how well built. Whether these wind knots actually worked is beside the point. The Vikings believed they worked, and that belief shaped their behavior in profound ways. Norse sailors who ventured into Finnish waters treated the local people with a caution that bordered on reverence. They did not raid Finnish settlements as casually as they raided elsewhere. They did not take Finnish slaves if they could avoid it. They traded fairly, paid their debts, and left offerings at sacred sites. They were afraid. Not afraid in the way they feared the Frankish cavalry or the Byzantine navy. Those were physical dangers that could be met with physical courage. This was a different kind of fear. A creeping, existential dread of powers that could not be fought, could not be seen, could not be escaped. There are darker stories too. Stories the Norse told in whispers, around fires in the depths of winter when the darkness pressed close and the mind wandered to forbidden places. They spoke of Finnish shamans who could kill at a distance. A curse spoken over a piece of a man's clothing, a strand of his hair, a drop of his blood, and that man would sicken and die, no matter how strong he was, no matter how far he traveled. The curse would follow him like a shadow, unseen but inescapable. They spoke of shapeshifters who could take the form of wolves or bears, hunting their enemies through the forest with animal cunning and supernatural endurance. A man might kill what he thought was a common wolf, only to find a human body when he examined his kill, and then the shapeshifter's kin would come seeking vengeance. They spoke of the dead who did not rest easy in the Finnish north. The spirits of ancestors lingered among the living, demanding offerings, punishing those who forgot them. A traveler who camped in the wrong place might find himself surrounded by the hungry ghosts of those who had died there, their cold hands reaching for his warmth, their hollow voices demanding to know why he had disturbed their rest. How much of this was true? How much was exaggeration, born of fear and misunderstanding? But the Norse interpretation of these practices was filtered through their own fears and assumptions. They saw the Finnish shamans through the lens of their own mythology, projecting onto them the qualities of the most fearsome magic workers in their own stories. The result was a picture of Finnish sorcery that was probably more terrifying than the reality, but that made it no less powerful as a source of fear. And so the Finns and the Sami endured, as they had endured for millennia before the Vikings came and would endure for millennia after they left. Their shamans continued their work, beating their drums in the long Arctic nights, sending their spirits soaring through the darkness. Their reindeer continued their migrations, following ancient paths across the tundra. Their way of life continued, largely unchanged by the wars and conquests that reshaped the rest of Europe. The Vikings feared many things. They feared the Frankish cavalry and the Byzantine fire. They feared the Irish fury and the Welsh mountains. They feared the sea and the storm and the wrath of their own gods. But few things chilled them quite like the magic of the north. The whispered curses. The wind knots. The shamans who could send their spirits flying through the darkness to bring sickness or death to those who had earned their displeasure. Some fears are born of weakness. But this fear was born of wisdom, the wisdom to recognize powers greater than oneself, and to treat them with the respect they deserved. Rest now. Let the northern lights fade softly from the sky. The shaman's drum has fallen silent, and the spirits have returned to their rest. The forest is still, the snow is falling gently, and the long Arctic night wraps everything in peace. In the next part of our journey, we will travel far to the south and east, to the greatest city in the medieval world. We will stand before the walls of Constantinople, where the Vikings encountered an empire that humbled their ambitions with fire and gold. The Byzantines possessed weapons and wealth beyond anything the Norse had ever seen, and they broke Viking invasions with a terrible efficiency. But that story waits. All the stories wait. For now, there is only the quiet. The soft whisper of snow falling on snow. The distant howl of wind across the frozen tundra. The deep, ancient silence of the north. Let yourself drift. Let yourself drift southward now, far from the frozen north, far from the misty shores of Britain and Ireland, far from everything familiar. We are traveling to a place unlike any the Vikings had ever seen, a city of marble and gold, of towering walls and glittering domes, of wealth so vast it seemed impossible, almost obscene. This is Constantinople, the queen of cities, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the greatest metropolis in the medieval world. Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders relax. The air is warmer here, scented with spices and incense, carrying the distant sounds of bells and chanting. We are entering a world of ancient power and sophisticated danger, a world that would teach the Vikings the true meaning of humility. The Vikings first learned of Constantinople through the eastern trade routes, the same rivers that carried them through Slavic territory and down to the Black Sea. They called it Miklagar, the great city, and the name was no exaggeration. In an age when most European cities held perhaps a few thousand people, Constantinople held hundreds of thousands. Its markets offered goods from every corner of the known world. Its treasuries overflowed with gold. To a Viking chieftain, raised in a world of wooden halls and turf-roofed farmsteads, Constantinople must have seemed like something from a dream. The sheer scale of it, the walls that stretched for miles, the churches larger than any building in Scandinavia, the palaces that housed emperors who claimed descent from the Caesars of ancient Rome. And the wealth. Always the wealth. The Byzantines measured their riches in talents of gold, in warehouses full of silk, in jewels that could ransom kingdoms. They paid their soldiers in gold coins stamped with the faces of emperors. They decorated their churches with mosaics made of precious stones and gilded glass. They dressed their nobles in purple robes dyed with extract from sea snails, a color so expensive that wearing it without permission was punishable by death. The Vikings wanted this wealth. They wanted it desperately. And in the year 860, they came to take it. The attack of 860 was led by the Rus, those Scandinavian settlers who had established themselves along the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They sailed down the Dnieper River to the Black Sea, crossed those dark waters in a fleet of perhaps 200 ships, and appeared without warning before the walls of Constantinople. The timing seemed perfect. The Byzantine Emperor, Michael III, was away with his army, fighting a war against the Abbasid Caliphate on the empire's eastern frontier. The city was lightly defended. The Rus expected easy pickings. They were wrong. Constantinople had faced invaders before, Persians, Arabs, Avars, Bulgars. The city had never fallen, not in the 5 centuries since Constantine the Great had made it his capital. Its walls were the most formidable fortifications in the world, a triple line of defenses that had broken every army sent against them. But the walls were only part of Byzantine power. The empire possessed something else, something the Vikings had never encountered before: Greek fire. No one today knows exactly how Greek fire was made. The formula was one of the most closely guarded secrets in Byzantine history, known only to the emperor and a handful of trusted officials. What we do know is that it was devastating. Greek fire was a liquid incendiary weapon, projected from bronze tubes mounted on the prows of Byzantine warships. It burned with fierce intensity, and unlike ordinary fire, it could not be extinguished with water. It floated on the surface of the sea, turning the water itself into an inferno. Ships caught in its path became floating pyres. Men who leaped overboard to escape found the flames following them, clinging to their skin, burning them alive as they tried desperately to swim away. The Vikings had never seen anything like it. They had no defense against it. Their wooden longships, which had carried them across oceans and up rivers, which had made them the terror of Europe, became death traps when faced with this supernatural weapon. The attack of 860 ended in disaster for the Rus. The Byzantine fleet emerged from the Golden Horn and fell upon them with Greek fire blazing. The chronicles speak of the sea burning, of Norse screams echoing across the water, of the sky lit orange by countless funeral pyres. The survivors fled, their dreams of plunder turned to ashes. They returned to their settlements along the Dnieper with a new understanding of the world, an understanding that there were powers even the Vikings could not challenge. But they did not give up. The Vikings rarely gave up. Over the following decades, the Rus tried again and again to crack the Byzantine defenses. In 907, according to the primary chronicle, though some historians doubt the account, a Rus prince named Oleg led a massive fleet against Constantinople. When the Greeks blocked the harbor with chains, Oleg supposedly had his ships mounted on wheels and rolled them overland to bypass the defenses. True or not, the story captures the determination of the Norse to find a way, any way, past those impenetrable walls. But in the end, it was not war that gave the Vikings access to Byzantine wealth. It was something far more pragmatic: trade. The Byzantines were practical people. They recognized that the Rus were not going away, that the trade routes through their territory were too valuable to abandon. And so they offered a deal, a series of treaties that gave the Rus access to Byzantine markets in exchange for peace. The terms were humiliating by Viking standards. Rus traders were required to surrender their weapons before entering Constantinople. They could only enter through one gate, could only stay in a specific district, could only purchase limited quantities of silk. They were treated not as honored guests but as potentially dangerous barbarians who needed to be carefully managed. And yet the Rus accepted. They accepted because they had no choice. Byzantine wealth was simply too tempting, and Byzantine power was simply too great to overcome by force. This was something new for the Vikings. Throughout their expansion across Europe, they had grown accustomed to taking what they wanted. Monasteries burned, kingdoms fell, tribute flowed north to Scandinavia in rivers of silver. But Constantinople did not burn. The Byzantine Empire did not fall. And the tribute, such as it was, flowed in the other direction, the Rus paying fees and taxes and tariffs for the privilege of trading in Byzantine markets. The Vikings had met their match. Harald Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and die at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, served in the Varangian Guard as a young man. He fought for the Byzantines across the Mediterranean, accumulating such wealth that he was able to fund an army upon his return to Scandinavia. His experience in Constantinople shaped him into the formidable warrior king he would become. This was the paradox of the Byzantine-Viking relationship. The Northmen came as enemies and became servants. They came to conquer and stayed to guard. They came seeking plunder and found something more valuable: a place in the greatest empire of the age, a chance to serve in the shadow of power beyond anything their homelands could offer. Some never returned to Scandinavia. They married Greek women, converted to Orthodox Christianity, and lived out their days in the warm southern sun, far from the cold fjords of their birth. Their descendants became Byzantines, their Norse blood diluted with each passing generation until nothing remained but perhaps a family name, a story told by grandchildren who had never seen snow. Others went home laden with gold and stories, spreading word of Byzantine wonders throughout the Viking world. They told of churches with domes that seemed to float like the sky itself. They told of markets where a man could buy anything, if he had the silver. They told of the emperor on his golden throne, surrounded by mechanical lions that roared and birds that sang, a display of wealth and technology so overwhelming that visitors sometimes fell to their knees in awe. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come like the warm southern night, gentle and all-encompassing. You are safe here, in the shadow of walls that have never fallen, under stars that have watched over emperors and kings. And the story will be here when you return. The Vikings first appeared in Iberian waters in the early 9th century, drawn by the same hunger for wealth that had driven them across all of Europe. They had heard tales of the riches of Al-Andalus, the Islamic territories of the Iberian Peninsula, and they came seeking plunder. At first, their raids followed the familiar pattern. They struck the coastlines of what is now Portugal and northwestern Spain, targeting monasteries and undefended towns. The Christian kingdoms of the north, still struggling to maintain their independence against Moorish pressure, were easy prey. The Vikings burned and looted and sailed away before any significant defense could be mounted. But then they pushed further south. They rounded the Great Rock of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean itself. And there they encountered something unexpected. The Moors were ready for them. Unlike the fragmented Christian kingdoms, the Islamic territories of Iberia were part of a sophisticated civilization with centuries of experience in warfare. The Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba, the dynasty that ruled Al-Andalus, maintained a professional navy, well-trained armies, and a network of coastal watchtowers designed to give early warning of seaborne attacks. When the Vikings appeared, the Moors did not panic. They did not flee inland and pray for deliverance. They fought back with organized, devastating efficiency. The most famous Viking raid into Islamic territory came in 844. A fleet of perhaps 50 or more longships sailed up the Guadalquivir River, the great waterway that led to Seville, one of the richest cities in Al-Andalus. The Vikings captured Seville and held it for over a week, plundering at will, seemingly unstoppable. But the Emir of Córdoba, Abd-ar-Rahman II, was not idle. He gathered his forces and marched to meet the invaders. The army he brought was unlike anything the Vikings had faced in the north. Disciplined cavalry mounted on swift Arabian horses, infantry armed with curved swords and composite bows, siege engineers who knew how to break fortifications. The battle that followed was a catastrophe for the Norse. The Moorish cavalry swept around the Viking flanks, cutting off their retreat to the ships. The infantry pressed forward with coordinated precision, their tactics honed by generations of warfare against both Christian kingdoms and rival Islamic states. The Vikings fought with their customary ferocity, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outmatched. When the slaughter was over, the Moors had killed or captured thousands of Vikings. The survivors fled to their ships and escaped to sea, but they left behind a terrible price. The heads of the Viking dead were gathered and sent to cities across the Islamic world as proof of the victory. Some were even shipped to the Caliph in Baghdad, a trophy demonstrating that the western outpost of Islam could defend itself against the northern barbarians. The message was clear. The Moors were not victims. They were warriors. The defeat of 844 did not end Viking interest in the Islamic world. The lure of Moorish wealth was too strong, and the Norse were not easily discouraged. Over the following decades, they returned again and again, probing for weaknesses, testing the defenses. But the Moors had learned from the first incursion. They strengthened their navy, building warships specifically designed to counter the Viking longships. These were galleys powered by oars and sail, fast and maneuverable, armed with catapults and Greek fire. Yes, the Moors had their own version of that terrible weapon, acquired through trade and espionage with the Byzantine East. They established a permanent coastal patrol, a fleet that swept the waters of the western Mediterranean, hunting for Viking raiders before they could reach the shore. They fortified the river mouths, building chains and booms that could block access to the inland waterways the Vikings favored. And they used intelligence. The Moors maintained networks of spies and informants throughout the Mediterranean, gathering information about Viking movements and intentions. When a Norse fleet set sail, the Moors often knew about it before the ships had cleared the Strait of Gibraltar. This was a level of sophistication the Vikings had rarely encountered. In the north, they had been able to exploit the chaos and fragmentation of their enemies. But the Islamic world was organized, coordinated, and ruthlessly efficient. It treated the Viking threat not as a surprise but as a problem to be solved, and it solved it with systematic thoroughness. There is a story, recorded in the Arabic chronicles, of a later Viking expedition that sailed into the Mediterranean seeking the riches of the south. They raided along the coasts of North Africa, attacking cities in what is now Morocco and Algeria. They even pushed as far as the Balearic Islands, capturing the city of Acre and holding it for ransom. But the Moorish response was swift and overwhelming. A fleet was assembled, larger than anything the Vikings could match, and it hunted them across the sea. The Norse found themselves constantly harassed, unable to land safely, unable to resupply, their numbers dwindling with each skirmish. In the end, the survivors limped back through the Strait of Gibraltar, their holds nearly empty, their crews decimated. Of the fleet that had set out, perhaps 60 ships or more, only a handful returned home. The riches of the Islamic South had proven to be fool's gold, glittering and tempting but impossible to grasp. The Vikings never mounted another major expedition into the Mediterranean. The lesson had been learned. The Moors were not prey. They were predators in their own right, and their waters were no place for casual raiding. But the relationship between Vikings and Moors was not purely hostile. As with so many things in the medieval world, commerce followed conflict. The Moors had things the Vikings wanted: silver, silk, spices, fine metalwork, the luxuries of a civilization far more advanced than anything in Scandinavia. And the Vikings had things the Moors wanted: furs from the northern forests, amber from the Baltic, and above all, slaves. The slave trade was one of the darkest aspects of the Viking economy, and the Islamic world was one of its largest markets. Norse raiders captured people from across Europe, Irish and English, Slavs and Franks, and shipped them south to be sold in the markets of Al-Andalus and beyond. These captives might end up as domestic servants, laborers, or worse, their fates. What did the Vikings learn from their encounters with the Islamic world? They learned, first and foremost, that there were civilizations in the world that matched or exceeded their own in military prowess. The Moors had professional armies, organized navies, sophisticated tactics. They could not be raided with impunity. They demanded respect. They learned that wealth was not simply there for the taking. The riches of Al-Andalus were real. The streets of Córdoba were lit by thousands of lamps. The libraries held hundreds of thousands of books. The courts glittered with gold and silk. But these riches were defended by men who knew how to fight and were willing to die rather than surrender. They learned, perhaps most importantly, that the world was larger and more complex than they had imagined. The frozen fjords of Scandinavia were only one corner of a vast and varied earth. There were peoples everywhere, peoples with their own histories, their own cultures, their own strengths. The Vikings were formidable, but they were not unique. And in some places, they were not even particularly impressive. This knowledge changed the Norse. It made them more cautious, more calculating, more willing to trade when trade was possible and fight only when fighting was necessary. The young raiders who had once charged recklessly into battle became older, wiser men who understood that courage without wisdom was simply a faster route to death. The Moors, for their part, remembered the Vikings as a nuisance rather than a serious threat. The Arabic chronicles mention the Norse raids almost in passing, noting them as one problem among many in the turbulent history of Al-Andalus. The Christian kingdoms to the north were a far greater concern. The internal rivalries of the Islamic world demanded more attention. The Vikings were simply another group of barbarians from beyond the civilized world, dangerous, certainly. Let yourself drift eastward now, beyond the Black Sea, beyond the rivers and forests of the Slavic lands, into a world of endless horizons. A world where the sky stretches so vast and blue that it seems to swallow everything beneath it. A world of grasslands that roll like frozen waves toward the edge of forever. This is the steppe. The great Eurasian grassland that stretches from the borders of Europe to the mountains of China. For thousands of years, it has been the highway of empires, the path along which the Huns and the Mongols, the Turks and the Avars, swept westward to reshape the world. And in the age of the Vikings, the western reaches of this steppe were ruled by a people unlike any the Norse had encountered before. The Khazars. Breathe slowly. Let your eyes grow heavy. The grass whispers in a wind that has blown since the beginning of time, and the story unfolds like the endless horizon itself, vast, patient, unhurried. The Khazar Khaganate was one of the most remarkable states of the medieval world, though it is largely forgotten today. At its height, it controlled a vast territory stretching from the Caucasus Mountains to the Volga River, from the shores of the Black Sea to the depths of Central Asia. It was a crossroads of civilizations, a place where East met West, where the trade routes from China and India intersected with those from Byzantium and Scandinavia. The Khazars themselves were a Turkic people, horse warriors who had migrated westward from the Asian steppes in the centuries after the fall of Rome. They had fought the Arabs to a standstill, blocking the expansion of the Islamic caliphates into the Caucasus and southern Russia. They had allied with Byzantium, exchanging princesses and ambassadors with the emperors in Constantinople. They had built cities and fortresses, organized a sophisticated government, and grown wealthy on the tolls and taxes of the trade routes they controlled. And they had done something that set them apart from every other major power of the age. They had converted to Judaism. The conversion of the Khazar ruling class to Judaism, sometime in the 8th century, the exact date is disputed, was one of the strangest events in medieval history. Surrounded by Christian Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate, the Khazars chose a third path, embracing the faith of a scattered people without land or armies. The reasons remain debated by historians. Perhaps it was a way of maintaining independence, of refusing to align with either of the great powers that pressed upon their borders. Perhaps it was genuine spiritual conviction. Perhaps it was simply the preference of a particular Khagan who happened to be in power at the right moment. Whatever the reason, the result was a Jewish empire on the steppes, a kingdom where the Torah was studied in felt tents, where the Sabbath was observed by horse warriors. The Vikings, particularly the Rus who had established themselves along the Dnieper and Volga rivers, wanted access to the wealth of the East. The Khazars controlled that access. Every trade route that led from Scandinavia to the markets of Persia and the Abbasid Caliphate passed through Khazar territory. Every cargo of furs and slaves and amber that moved south, every shipment of silver and silk and spices that moved north, was subject to Khazar tolls. This created a complex relationship between the two peoples, part alliance, part rivalry, always wary. The Khazars were not opposed to trade with the Norse. They welcomed it, in fact. The Rus brought goods from the north that fetched high prices in the markets of the east: Arctic furs, walrus ivory, honey, and wax. They brought slaves, captured in raids across the Baltic and beyond, who could be sold to buyers in the Islamic world. The Khazars took their percentage and allowed the trade to flow. But the Khazars were also keenly aware that the Rus were dangerous. These were not peaceful merchants. They were warriors, raiders, men who took what they wanted when they could. The Khazar authorities kept a close eye on Rus trading expeditions, monitoring their movements, limiting their access to sensitive areas. And when the Norse stepped out of line, the Khazars responded with overwhelming force. The Khazar military was built around cavalry, fast, mobile, deadly. The steppe had bred them for this kind of warfare. From childhood, Khazar boys learned to ride and shoot, to control a horse with their knees while drawing a bow, to fight in loose formations that could swirl around an enemy like water around a stone. This was a style of warfare the Vikings had never mastered. The Norse were sailors and infantry fighters. They were supreme in the shield wall, devastating in close combat. But on the open steppe, where there were no ships to carry them and no walls to anchor their formations, they were vulnerable. Khazar cavalry could strike from any direction, loosing arrows from impossible ranges, refusing to close for hand-to-hand combat unless the odds were overwhelmingly in their favor. They could harass a Norse force for days, wearing it down through exhaustion and attrition, then sweep in for the kill when it was weakened beyond resistance. The Russ learned this lesson the hard way. There are fragmentary accounts in the sources of Viking expeditions into Khazar territory that ended in disaster. Columns of warriors caught in the open, surrounded, destroyed. The steppe swallowed them, and the Khazars barely broke stride. This did not mean the Vikings avoided the Khazar realm. The lure of Eastern silver was too strong. But they learned to approach with caution, to seek permission rather than demanding access, to trade rather than raid. The Khazars were not enemies to be conquered. They were powers to be negotiated with, carefully, respectfully, always aware that the balance could shift at any moment. This was perhaps the greatest lesson the Vikings took from their encounters with the Khazars. Not how to fight, though they learned that too. Not how to trade, though they mastered those skills as well. But how to see, how to look at the world with open eyes, taking in its complexity, its diversity, its endless capacity to surprise. The steppe stretched away to the east, golden and infinite, hiding secrets the Vikings would never fully uncover. The Khazars had been masters of that vast realm, drawing wealth and power from its depths. And then they were gone, swept away by the tides of history, leaving only echoes and memories. But those echoes shaped the world that came after. And the Vikings, who had touched the edge of that vanished empire, carried its influence with them to the ends of the earth. Rest now. Let the steppe fade into the gathering darkness. The fire is burning low, and the horses are settling for the night, their breath steaming in the cooling air. The stars are emerging, one by one, in a sky so vast that it seems to contain all the stars that ever were or ever will be. In the next part of our journey, we will return to the sea, but not to any sea the Vikings could conquer. We will speak of the ocean itself, the great Atlantic that gave the Norse their power but also claimed countless lives. The sea was the Vikings' greatest ally and their most constant fear, and its lessons were written in salt and storm and silence. But that story waits. All the stories wait. For now, there is only the quiet. The soft whisper of wind through endless grass. The distant whinny of a horse dreaming of running. The deep, ancient peace of the steppe at rest. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come like the vast darkness that settles over the grasslands, gentle and all-encompassing. You are safe here, in this place between worlds, under stars that have watched over empires and nomads and wanderers since the beginning of time. And the story will be here. Let yourself drift now, away from the land, away from the solid earth with its mountains and forests, and endless steppes. We are returning to the element that defined the Vikings more than any other, the sea. The cold, gray, magnificent, terrible sea. The ocean gave the Vikings everything. It was their highway, their hunting ground, their pathway to wealth and glory. Without the sea, they would have been just another group of Scandinavian farmers, scratching a living from the thin northern soil. The sea made them what they were. But the sea also took. It took ships and crews, dreams and lives. It swallowed the proud and the humble alike, showing no mercy, offering no quarter. For every Viking who returned home laden with silver, another vanished into the waves, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow heavy and still. The waves are gentle tonight, rocking us softly, but we have always known, that the sea can change in an instant. That is the first lesson every sailor learns. The North Atlantic is one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. This is not poetry or exaggeration. It is simple fact. The ocean between Scandinavia and the lands beyond, Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, the distant shores of North America, is a realm of perpetual violence. Storms breed in the cold waters where Arctic currents meet the warmer flows from the south. Waves can build to heights that seem impossible, walls of black water that dwarf the largest ships. Winds can shift from calm to gale in less than an hour, catching even experienced sailors off guard. And the cold. Always the cold. The water temperature in the North Atlantic rarely rises above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even in summer. A man who falls overboard has perhaps 15 minutes before hypothermia steals his strength. After 30 minutes, he is likely dead, his muscles locked, His heart slowed, his body sinking into the darkness below. The Vikings knew this. They had grown up with this knowledge, inherited it from their fathers and grandfathers, absorbed it through countless generations of living beside the sea. They respected the ocean as they respected the gods themselves, perhaps more, for the gods were distant and capricious, while the sea was always present, always watching, always ready to claim the unwary. Every voyage was a gamble. Every departure might be the last. When a Viking ship left harbor, those who remained behind knew they might never see their loved ones again. There was no way to send word, no way to know what had happened until either the ship returned or enough time had passed that hope became foolish. The sagas are filled with ships that simply vanished, crews of brave men who sailed beyond the horizon and were never seen again. No wreckage. No survivors. No explanation. Just absence, growing into certainty, hardening into grief. The Vikings did everything they could to improve their odds. Their ships were marvels of engineering, light and flexible, able to ride the waves rather than fight against them. The hulls were built from overlapping planks that could flex with the motion of the water, absorbing stresses that would crack a rigid vessel. The shallow draft allowed them to navigate close to shore, reducing the time spent in open water where danger was greatest. They learned to read the sea as others might read a book. They knew the meaning of every cloud formation, every shift in wind, every change in the color of the water. They watched the behavior of birds, noting which species flew toward land and which flew away from it. They observed the patterns of seaweed and debris, looking for signs of currents that might help or hinder their passage. They navigated by the sun and the stars, by the direction of prevailing winds, by the flight of birds and the movement of whales. They had no compass. That technology would not reach Scandinavia until long after the Viking Age ended. They had no charts beyond the rough sketches scratched onto pieces of wood or bone. They sailed by experience and intuition, by knowledge passed down through generations, by a feel for the sea that cannot be taught but only learned through years of practice. And still, they died. They died in storms that rose without warning. They died when fog closed in and they lost their way, sailing in circles until their provisions ran out. They died when their ships sprang leaks in heavy weather, the water rising faster than they could bail. They died when ice crushed their hulls in the far north, or when they were swept onto rocks they never saw coming. The sea was impartial. It killed the wise and the foolish alike. A man could have decades of experience, could have sailed 100 voyages without mishap, and still be taken by a wave he never saw, a storm he never expected, a current that dragged him where he didn't know. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from being on the open ocean in a small boat. It is different from the fear of battle, where at least you can see your enemy, where courage and skill might make a difference. The fear of the sea is the fear of helplessness, the knowledge that no matter how brave you are, no matter how strong, the ocean is stronger. It does not care about your courage. It does not respect your determination. It simply is, vast and indifferent, and you are very, very small. The Vikings felt this fear. We know they did because they wrote about it, in their sagas and their poems, in the kennings they used to describe the sea. They called it the whale road, and the swan's path, trying to tame it with poetry, to make it familiar through language. But beneath the beautiful words was the same ancient terror that every sailor has known since the first human pushed a log into the water and tried to float. They told stories of sea monsters, the kraken, a creature so vast it could be mistaken for an island, with tentacles that could drag ships down to the depths. They spoke of the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, coiled around the world beneath the waves, waiting for the end of days. They imagined the sea as a living thing, hungry and malevolent, always seeking to devour the ships that dared to cross its surface. Were these stories true? Of course not in any literal sense. But they captured something true, the feeling of vulnerability, the sense that forces beyond human comprehension lurked beneath the waves. The sea was not just water. It was a world unto itself, as alien and unknowable as the stars above. And yet they sailed. Despite the fear, despite the losses, despite the certain knowledge that the sea would take some of them and there was nothing they could do to prevent it. They sailed because the rewards were worth the risks. They sailed because staying home meant a slow death of poverty and insignificance. They sailed because they were Vikings, and sailing was what Vikings did. There is something admirable in this, something that transcends the violence and brutality that characterized so much of Viking life. The courage to face the unknown, to push beyond the safe and familiar, to risk everything for the chance of something more. This is a quality that speaks to something deep in the human spirit. The Vikings were not afraid to be afraid. They did not pretend that the sea was safe or that they were invulnerable. They acknowledged their fear, sang songs about it, told stories about the men who had died and the ships that had vanished. And then they went anyway, because some things are worth doing even when they are dangerous. Perhaps especially when they are dangerous. This is the paradox at the heart of the Viking relationship with the sea. It was their greatest ally and their greatest enemy. It gave them everything they had and took everything it wanted. They loved it and feared it in equal measure, the way you might love and fear a god, with reverence, with awe, with the knowledge that your fate ultimately rested in hands larger than your own. The sea taught the Vikings humility. Not the cringing humility of the defeated, but the clear-eyed humility of those who understand their place in the world. They were strong, yes. They were brave. They were skilled and determined and willing to dare what others would not. But the sea was stronger. The sea was older. The sea would be there long after the last Viking was dust and the last saga was forgotten. When a Viking died at sea, and many did, far from home, far from family, far from the familiar shores they would never see again, his companions believed his spirit went to the realm of Ran, goddess of the deep. She was said to welcome drowned sailors into her underwater hall, a place of strange beauty where the dead feasted forever beneath the waves. This was a comfort, perhaps, for those who lost loved ones to the sea. To imagine them not simply gone, not simply erased, but transformed, becoming part of the ocean that had claimed them, joining a community of the drowned that stretched back through the ages. But it was also an acknowledgement of the sea's power. Other gods might be bargained with, might be swayed by sacrifice and prayer. Ran simply took. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for the appointed time. When she wanted a life, she reached up from the depths and pulled it down, and there was nothing anyone could do. The Vikings accepted this. They did not rage against it, did not curse the unfairness of it, did not demand that the universe conform to their wishes. They understood that the sea was beyond such concerns, that it operated according to laws older than the gods themselves. And so they made their peace with it, sailing out each season with the knowledge that some of them would not return. This acceptance was not fatalism. It was something more nuanced, a recognition that risk and reward are inseparable, that you cannot have the glory without the danger, that life itself is a voyage across uncertain waters and the only real choice is whether to sail or to stay forever in the harbor. To understand Viking violence, you must first understand Viking honor. Honor was not an abstract concept for the Norse. It was as real and tangible as silver or land. A man's honor determined his standing in the community, his ability to attract followers, his prospects for marriage and alliance. To lose honor was to lose everything. A man without honor was a man without a future. And honor, once lost, could only be restored through blood. If someone insulted you, you had to respond. If someone cheated you, you had to seek compensation. If someone killed your kinsman, you had to kill them in return, or at the very least, accept blood money as restitution. To fail in any of these obligations was to prove yourself weak, to invite further abuse, to condemn yourself and your family to a slow slide into obscurity and contempt. This created a society balanced on a knife's edge. Every slight, every dispute, every misunderstanding carried the potential to escalate into lethal violence. The sagas are filled with stories of feuds that began over trivial matters, a borrowed axe not returned, a careless word spoken at a feast, a glance that lingered too long on another man's wife, and ended with entire families destroyed. The cycle was grimly predictable. A man was killed. His kinsmen were obligated to avenge him. They killed the killer, or one of his relatives. Now the other side was obligated to respond. They killed someone in return. And so it went, back and forth, generation after generation, until one family was exterminated or both sides were too exhausted to continue. To understand Viking violence, you must first understand Viking honor. Honor was not an abstract concept for the Norse. It was as real and tangible as silver or land. A man's honor determined his standing in the community, his ability to attract followers, his prospects for marriage and alliance. To lose honor was to lose everything. A man without honor was a man without a future. And honor, once lost, could only be restored through blood. If someone insulted you, you had to respond. If someone cheated you, you had to seek compensation. If someone killed your kinsman, you had to kill them in return, or at the very least, accept blood money as restitution. To fail in any of these obligations was to prove yourself weak, to invite further abuse, to condemn yourself and your family to a slow slide into obscurity and contempt. This created a society balanced on a knife's edge. Every slight, every dispute, every misunderstanding carried the potential to escalate into lethal violence. The sagas are filled with stories of feuds that began over trivial matters: a borrowed axe not returned, a careless word spoken at a feast, a glance that lingered too long on another man's wife, and ended with entire families destroyed. The cycle was grimly predictable. A man was killed. His kinsmen were obligated to avenge him. They killed the killer, or one of his relatives. Now the other side was obligated to respond. They killed someone in return. And so it went, back and forth, generation after generation, until one family was exterminated or both sides were too exhausted to continue. The Icelanders, who were Vikings twice removed, descended from Norse settlers who had fled Norway to escape exactly this kind of violence, recorded their feuds with particular care. The Icelandic sagas are essentially extended chronicles of blood feuds, tracing the intricate webs of obligation and vengeance that shaped their society. Consider the saga of Burnt Njal, perhaps the greatest of the Icelandic sagas. It tells the story of Njal or Jerson, a wise and peaceable man, and his friend Gunnar Hamundarson, a mighty warrior. Despite their best efforts to avoid conflict, they are drawn into a feud that escalates relentlessly, claiming life after life, until finally Njal himself is burned alive in his own home by his enemies. The tragedy of the saga is not that bad men do bad things. It is that good men, men who genuinely want peace, who try again and again to find a way out of the cycle, are ultimately helpless against the logic of the feud. Once violence has begun, it takes on a momentum of its own. Honor demands response. Response demands counter-response. And the bodies pile up. This was the world the Vikings lived in. Not a world of random savagery, but a world of rules, terrible, remorseless rules that trapped everyone in a web of obligation and violence. A man might hate the feud he was caught in, might wish desperately for peace, but he could not simply walk away. To refuse to avenge a kinsman was to shame yourself and your entire family. It was, in a sense, to cease to be a person at all. Now let us speak of something even darker, the violence that erupted within families themselves. The Vikings practiced partible inheritance, meaning that a father's property was divided among all his sons. This was intended to be fair, but it often led to conflict. Brothers who had grown up together, who had played and worked and fought side by side, became rivals when their father died. Each wanted the best land, the finest ships, the largest share of the silver. And when negotiation failed, they reached for their swords. The sagas and the histories are filled with tales of fratricide, brothers killing brothers and disputes over inheritance. The violence was all the more terrible because it violated the deepest bonds of kinship. These were not strangers fighting over resources. These were men who had shared a womb, who had grown up in the same hall, who had called the same woman mother. And yet they killed each other. They killed each other with the same efficiency and determination they showed against foreign enemies, perhaps more, for a foreign enemy might be content with plunder and tribute, while a brother fighting for inheritance wanted everything. The Norwegian royal succession was particularly bloody. King after king came to power by killing his brothers, his uncles, his cousins. The Ynglinga saga, which traces the legendary history of the Norwegian royal line, reads at times like a catalogue of family murders. Each generation produced its crop of corpses, each throne was purchased with kinsmen's blood. This was the price of power in the Viking world. If you wanted to rule, you had to be willing to kill, not just your enemies, but your own family. The men who hesitated, who showed mercy to defeated relatives, often found that mercy repaid with treachery. The sagas taught a brutal lesson. In the struggle for power, there were no bonds of kinship strong enough to guarantee safety. Why did the Vikings tolerate this level of internal violence? Why did they not develop stronger institutions to control it? Kings with real power, courts that could enforce their judgments, laws that carried weight beyond the willingness of individuals to enforce them. The answer lies in the nature of Viking society itself. The Norse valued independence above almost everything else. They had left their homelands, in many cases, precisely to escape the control of kings and jarls. The idea of submitting to an authority that could tell them what to do, that could punish them for exercising their own judgment, was deeply offensive to their sense of themselves. This independence had its virtues. It produced men of remarkable self-reliance, capable of sailing across oceans and founding colonies with minimal support. It fostered a kind of rough democracy, where even thralls might earn their freedom and free men could speak their minds in the assembly without fear. But it also meant that there was no one to stop the feuds. No king was powerful enough to impose his peace on unwilling subjects. No court could enforce a judgment against a man who had the strength and the will to resist. The law existed, elaborate and detailed, but it was ultimately toothless, a framework for negotiation rather than a system of compulsion. But often they did not. Often the logic of the feud proved stronger than any attempt to contain it. Often the bodies continued to pile up, and the grieving continued, and the young men grew up with hatred in their hearts, ready to continue the violence their fathers had begun. This was the shadow that hung over every feast, every assembly, every family gathering. The knowledge that the man beside you might be your death. The awareness that blood was no guarantee of loyalty, that kinship was a tie that could be broken as easily as any other. It was a hard world. A violent world. A world that demanded constant vigilance and offered no guarantees. But it was also a world that produced the sagas, those magnificent tales of flawed humans struggling against impossible circumstances, making terrible choices and living with terrible consequences. The Vikings turned their suffering into art, their grief into poetry, their violence into stories that still have the power to move us 1,000 years later. Perhaps that is their greatest legacy. Not the silver they plundered or the lands they conquered, but the stories they told, stories that teach us something about the human condition, about the costs of honor and the price of vengeance, about the loneliness of power and the tragedy of kin killing kin. Rest now. Let the longhouse grow quiet around you. The fire is burning low, and the tensions of the evening are fading into exhaustion. The feuds will continue tomorrow, but tonight there is peace, the fragile peace of darkness, of sleep, of a brief respite from the demands of honor. In the next part of our journey, we will look upward, to the gods who watched over the Vikings, to the fate that bound them, to the shadow of Ragnarok that loomed over everything they did. The Norse feared their gods as much as they worshipped them, and the knowledge that even the gods would die gave their world a tragic grandeur that still haunts us today. But that story waits. All the stories wait. For now, there is only the quiet. The soft crackle of the dying fire. The creak of timber settling into rest. The deep, heavy breathing of men who have laid down their weapons for the night. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come like a truce, temporary but we. Let yourself drift upward now, away from the violence of the mortal world, towards something older and stranger. We are entering the realm of the gods, not the Christian god that the Vikings would eventually encounter, but their own ancient deities. The Aesir and the Vanir. Odin and Thor, Freya and Frey, Loki and Hel. These gods did not offer comfort. They did not promise salvation. They did not love humanity the way the Christian God was said to love his children. They were powerful and capricious, generous and cruel, bound by the same fate that bound all living things. And in the end, even they would die. Breathe slowly. Let your eyes grow heavy. We are walking now through the mists of Norse mythology, through a world of sacred groves and blood sacrifice, of prophecy and doom. It is a strange place, beautiful and terrible, and the Vikings lived their entire lives within its shadow. The Vikings did not worship their gods the way we might understand worship. There was no regular attendance at services, no weekly rituals of prayer and praise. Instead, there were sacrifices, blots, they were called, performed at certain times of year, at moments of crisis, when the favor of the gods was needed or their anger had to be appeased. Animals were killed. Horses were particularly valued, their blood sprinkled on the altars and the worshippers alike. The meat was cooked and eaten in great communal feasts, the gods receiving their portion through the smoke that rose toward the sky. And sometimes, in times of great need or great celebration, the sacrifices were human. We should not look away from this. The Vikings practiced human sacrifice. The evidence is too strong to deny. Archaeological finds of bodies in bogs and graves, descriptions in Arab and Christian sources, references in the sagas themselves. Slaves, captives, sometimes volunteers who believed they would join the gods in death. All were offered up on the altars of Odin and the other powers. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was transaction. The gods were powerful, but they were not all powerful. They needed sustenance, attention, the life force that flowed in blood. In return, they might grant victory, prosperity, good harvests, safe voyages. The relationship was reciprocal, gift for gift, blood for blessing. But there were no guarantees. The gods might accept the sacrifice and still withhold their favor. They might be pleased today and angry tomorrow. They followed their own designs, and those designs were not always comprehensible to mortals. This uncertainty hung over everything the Vikings did. They could offer their best horses, their finest treasures, even their own children, and still find themselves defeated in battle or drowned at sea or starving through a long winter. The gods were watching, always watching, but their silence was impossible to interpret. Of all the gods, Odin was the most feared. He was the All-Father, the king of the gods, the lord of wisdom and war and death. He had sacrificed his own eye for knowledge, hanging himself on the world tree for 9 days and nights to learn the secret of the runes. He was a wanderer, appearing among mortals in disguise, testing their hospitality, rewarding the generous and punishing the stingy. But Odin was not a protector. He did not watch over his worshippers the way Thor protected farmers or Frey blessed the harvest. Odin's interest was in warriors, specifically in dead warriors. His hall, Valhalla, was filled with the Einherjar, the chosen slain, who spent their days fighting and their nights feasting, preparing for the final battle at the end of the world. And Odin chose who died in battle. This was the terrifying truth that hung over every Viking warrior. Victory and defeat, life and death, were not simply matters of skill and courage. They were matters of divine selection. Odin might look down on a battle and decide that he needed a particular warrior for his army. He might withdraw his favor at the crucial moment, allowing a lesser fighter to strike down a better one. The sagas are filled with moments where warriors realize that Odin has turned against them. A spear appears from nowhere, thrown by a one-eyed stranger. A horse stumbles at the worst possible moment. A sword breaks in the middle of combat. These are Odin's interventions, his way of claiming the warriors he wants. There was no defense against this. You could not bribe Odin, could not convince him to spare you. If he had decided that your time had come, your time had come. The best you could hope for was to die well, sword in hand, facing your enemies, earning your place among the chosen slain. Now let us speak of the greatest fear of all, the fear that hung over gods and mortals alike, that made even Odin anxious, that gave Norse mythology its unique quality of tragic grandeur. Ragnarok. The twilight of the gods. The Norse believed that the world was not eternal. It had a beginning, and it would have an end. The end was foretold in prophecy, recorded in the Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, and it was terrible beyond imagination. First would come the Fimbulwinter, 3 years of endless cold, when the sun would give no warmth and snow would fall from every direction. Brothers would kill brothers. The bonds of kinship would dissolve. All the violence that lurked beneath the surface of society would erupt into open chaos. Then the monsters would break free. Fenrir the wolf, who had been bound by the gods with unbreakable chains, would shatter his bonds and devour Odin himself. The Midgard serpent would rise from the ocean depths, poisoning the sky with its venom. Loki, the trickster god, would lead an army of the dead against the halls of Asgard. The gods would fight. Thor would kill the serpent but die from its poison. Odin would be swallowed by the wolf. The fire giant Surtur would set the world ablaze, and everything, gods, monsters, humans, the world itself, would be consumed in flames. This was not a distant threat, not a vague possibility. It was certainty. The Norse believed it would happen. They did not know when, but they knew it was coming, as surely as night follows day, as surely as winter follows summer. And here is the strangest thing of all: they did not despair. The Vikings lived with the knowledge that everything they loved was doomed. Their gods would die. Their world would burn. All their achievements, all their glory, all their struggles and sacrifices would be erased in the final conflagration. And yet they continued to fight, to build, to strive for honor and victory. Now let us speak of the greatest fear of all, the fear that hung over gods and mortals alike, that made even Odin anxious, that gave Norse mythology its unique quality of tragic grandeur. Ragnarok. The twilight of the gods. The Norse believed that the world was not eternal. It had a beginning, and it would have an end. The end was foretold in prophecy, recorded in the Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, and it was terrible beyond imagination. First would come the Fimbulwinter, 3 years of endless cold, when the sun would give no warmth and snow would fall from every direction. Brothers would kill brothers. The bonds of kinship would dissolve. All the violence that lurked beneath the surface of society would erupt into open chaos. Then the monsters would break free. Fenrir the wolf, who had been bound by the gods with unbreakable chains, would shatter his bonds and devour Odin himself. The Midgard serpent would rise from the ocean depths, poisoning the sky with its venom. Loki, the trickster god, would lead an army of the dead against the halls of Asgard. The gods would fight. Thor would kill the serpent but die from its poison. Odin would be swallowed by the wolf. The fire giant Surtur would set the world ablaze, and everything, gods, monsters, humans, the world itself, would be consumed in flames. This was not a distant threat, not a vague possibility. It was certainty. The Norse believed it would happen. They did not know when, but they knew it was coming, as surely as night follows day, as surely as winter follows summer. And here is the strangest thing of all: they did not despair. The Vikings lived with the knowledge that everything they loved was doomed. Their gods would die. Their world would burn. All their achievements, all their glory, all their struggles and sacrifices would be erased in the final conflagration. And yet they continued to fight, to build, to strive for honor and victory. The gods knew they would die at Ragnarok. They had known since the beginning of time. And yet they continued to maintain the order of the cosmos, to protect humanity from the forces of chaos, to delay the final reckoning as long as possible. They did not give up simply because they knew they could not ultimately win. And the Vikings took this as their model. A warrior did not fight because he was certain of victory. He fought because fighting was right, because courage was its own reward, because the manner of his struggle mattered more than its outcome. This gave Norse culture a quality of tragic heroism that still resonates today. The Vikings were not naive optimists who believed everything would work out in the end. They were not fatalists who surrendered to despair. They were something rarer, people who looked directly at the certainty of death and destruction and said, "Nevertheless, I will stand." This is perhaps the most profound thing the Vikings can teach us. Not their skill in battle or their mastery of the sea, not their courage or their cruelty, but their willingness to live fully and fight fiercely in a world where everything, eventually, would be lost. They feared the gods because the gods were fearsome. They feared Ragnarok because Ragnarok was real. But they did not let their fear paralyze them. They did not use the certainty of doom as an excuse for despair or nihilism. They used it as a reason to live with intensity, to seek honor in every moment, to make their brief time in the world count for something. The gods watched in silence, and the Vikings could not know what they were thinking. The end was coming, and nothing could prevent it. But until that end arrived, there was work to be done, glory to be won, stories to be told. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come like the darkness before Ragnarok, peaceful, patient, knowing that the dawn will come again, for now, for tonight, for this moment of rest between the struggles. Let yourself sink deeper now, into a quieter kind of darkness. We have spoken of battles and blood feuds, of gods and monsters, of the violence that shaped the Viking world. But tonight we speak of something different, something the Vikings feared as much as any enemy they could face with sword in hand. The invisible enemies. The forces that could not be fought, could not be bargained with, could not be intimidated or outmaneuvered. Disease. Famine. The long, merciless winter that could swallow a family, a village, an entire region in its frozen jaws. These were the enemies that humbled the mightiest warriors. A man who had survived 100 battles might be brought low by a fever in the night. A chieftain whose name was sung in halls across Scandinavia might watch his children die of hunger, powerless to save them. A community that had thrived for generations might simply cease to exist after one particularly brutal winter. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow heavy and warm. We are walking through the shadows of the Viking world tonight, but even shadows eventually give way to light. And then there was disease. The Vikings lived in close quarters, families sharing longhouses with their animals, communities crowded together in settlements where everyone knew everyone else. These conditions were perfect for the spread of illness. When one person got sick, everyone got sick. When a ship arrived from foreign lands carrying new pathogens, entire regions could be devastated. We do not know exactly which diseases afflicted the Vikings most severely. The sources are vague, speaking of plagues and pestilences without describing symptoms in enough detail for modern diagnosis. But we know the effects: mass deaths, abandoned settlements, the disruption of trade and travel as people fled from infected areas. Smallpox was almost certainly a killer. So was typhus, carried by the lice that infested even the wealthiest households. Dysentery struck communities with contaminated water supplies. Tuberculosis lingered in the lungs of the crowded and the poorly nourished. Influenza swept through in waves, deadly to the very young and the very old. The Vikings had no understanding of germ theory, no concept of how diseases spread. They blamed illness on evil spirits, on the curses of enemies, on the displeasure of the gods. They treated the sick with herbs and charms, with prayers and sacrifices, with remedies that might sometimes help and might sometimes make things worse. Mostly, they waited. They tended their sick as best they could, made offerings to whatever powers they thought might help, and hoped that the fever would break, the coughing would stop, the strength would return. Sometimes it did. Often it did not. The psychological impact of disease was as devastating as its physical toll. The Vikings valued strength above almost everything else. A warrior who could no longer lift his sword, a farmer who could no longer work his fields, a sailor who could no longer pull an oar, these were men diminished, their identities shattered, their places in the community uncertain. Disease struck without regard to courage or honor. The bravest warrior was as vulnerable as the most timid thrall. The wealthiest chieftain was as likely to fall ill as the poorest farmer. There was no defense, no strategy, no way to fight back against an enemy that could not be seen. This helplessness was terrifying to a people who prized self-reliance and personal agency. A Viking could face death in battle with courage, knowing that his fate was in his own hands, that his skill and bravery might make the difference. But death by disease offered no such dignity. It came in the night, silent and indifferent, and it took whoever it pleased. The Vikings developed a fatalistic attitude toward illness that was both practical and heartbreaking. They accepted that some people would sicken and die, that nothing could be done, that the will of the gods was beyond mortal understanding. They grieved for their dead and moved on, because there was no alternative. Life in the north was hard enough without dwelling on what could not be changed. But the fear remained. The knowledge that at any moment, without warning, a fever might begin its work. That the child who was playing this morning might be burning with heat by evening. That the friend who shared your bench at the feast might not live to see the next full moon. This was the shadow that hung over every Viking life, the awareness of fragility, of mortality, of how quickly everything could be taken away. And then there was the winter itself. We have spoken of Scandinavian winters before, but it is worth lingering on them, because they were central to everything the Vikings experienced. For those of us who live in milder climates, it is difficult to imagine what these winters were really like. The darkness was the first challenge. In the northern reaches of Scandinavia, above the Arctic Circle, the sun did not rise at all during the depths of winter. For weeks, the world was wrapped in perpetual twilight, a gray half-light that faded to black in the afternoon and did not brighten again until long after most people had gone to sleep. This darkness affected everything. It disrupted sleep patterns, confused the body's natural rhythms, created a constant low-level exhaustion that made every task more difficult. It bred a particular kind of melancholy, what we might today call seasonal depression, a heaviness of spirit that settled over communities like the snow that buried their fields. And the cold. The terrible, endless cold. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero, and could plunge much lower during the worst spells. The wind howled down from the north, driving the cold through every crack in the walls, every gap in the clothing, every weakness in the body's defenses. Frostbite was common. Hypothermia was a constant danger for anyone caught outside too long. The snow piled higher and higher, burying paths and roads, isolating communities from each other, making travel nearly impossible. A village that had been a few hours' walk away in summer might as well have been on the moon in winter. If something went wrong, if the food ran out, if disease struck, if an accident happened, there was no help to be had. Each community was on its own, locked in a struggle for survival that would last until the spring thaw. The mightiest warrior could be felled by a fever. The wealthiest chieftain could watch his children starve. The bravest explorer could freeze to death within sight of his own hall if he was caught in a blizzard. These lessons stayed with the Vikings. They made them cautious as well as courageous, prudent as well as bold. They reminded them that human life was fragile, that fortune was fickle, that the only certainty was uncertainty itself. And perhaps this is why the Vikings feared these invisible enemies so deeply. Not because they were deadlier than swords, though they were. Not because they struck without warning, though they did. But because they revealed a truth that warriors preferred to forget, that in the end, no amount of courage or skill could guarantee survival. The world was larger than human will, and it would have its way. Rest now. Let the cold fade into memory. The fire is burning steady, and the walls are holding against the wind, and the long night is passing as it always does. Spring will come again. It always comes again. In the next part of our journey, we will travel backward in time, to the age before the Vikings began their raids. We will speak of the Saxons of the continent, the Germanic people whom Charlemagne converted by the sword, and the warning their fate represented to the pagan Norse. The Saxons showed what happened to heathens who resisted the Christian tide, and the Vikings watched and learned. But that story waits. All the stories wait. For now, there is only the quiet. The soft crackle of the fire. The gentle breathing of the family asleep under their furs. The deep, patient silence of the winter night. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come like the darkness outside, soft and complete, wrapping you in its peaceful embrace. You are safe here, warm here, sheltered from the cold and the disease and all the invisible enemies of the world. And the story will be here when you return. Let yourself drift backward now, through the mists of time, to an age before the Viking raids began. Before the longships appeared on the coasts of Britain and Francia. Before the monasteries burned and the silver flowed north. We are traveling to a moment that shaped everything that came after, a moment of terrible violence that sent a warning echoing across the pagan north. We are speaking of the Saxons. Not the Anglo-Saxons of Britain, who had crossed the sea centuries earlier, but their cousins who remained on the continent. The Germanic tribes who lived in the forests and plains of what is now northern Germany, fierce, independent, devoted to their ancient gods. And we are speaking of the man who broke them. Charlemagne. Charles the Great. The king who would become emperor, who would unite much of Western Europe under his rule, who would force the Christian faith upon the last great pagan people of the continent. Breathe slowly. Let your eyes grow heavy. This is a dark chapter in history, but we will walk through it gently, as one walks through a cemetery at dusk, with respect for the dead and awareness of what their fates can teach the living. The Saxon Wars began in 772 and would continue, off and on, for over 30 years. They were among the bloodiest and most brutal conflicts of the medieval period, a campaign of conquest that would leave the Saxon people shattered, their culture suppressed, their gods destroyed. Charlemagne's first campaign struck at the heart of Saxon religion. His army marched into Saxon territory, defeated the warriors who rose to oppose them, and then advanced on the Irminsul, that sacred pillar that the Saxons believed held up the heavens. They cut it down. The destruction of the Irminsul was not merely military strategy. It was a theological statement, a demonstration of power that went beyond the physical. Charlemagne was showing the Saxons that their gods could not protect them, that the Christian God was stronger, that resistance was not just futile but spiritually meaningless. The Saxons were devastated. But they did not submit. Over the following years, the pattern repeated again and again. Charlemagne would invade, would win battles, would force Saxon chieftains to accept baptism and swear oaths of loyalty. He would withdraw, believing the conquest complete. And then the Saxons would rise again, renouncing their forced conversions, killing the priests and officials Charlemagne had left behind, returning to the worship of their ancient gods. The resistance was led by a chieftain named Widukind, a man whose name would echo through Saxon memory for centuries. He was not a king, the Saxons had no kings, but he became a symbol of defiance, a leader who could unite the fractious tribes against their common enemy. Again and again, he escaped capture, fled into the forests or across the border into Danish territory, only to reappear when Charlemagne's attention was elsewhere. The Frankish king grew frustrated. His campaigns against the Saxons were draining his resources, distracting him from other concerns, making him look weak before his rivals. The massacre did not end Saxon resistance. If anything, it intensified it. The following years saw some of the fiercest fighting of the entire war, as the Saxons rose again and again, preferring death to submission. Charlemagne responded with ever more brutal measures: mass deportations, the destruction of entire villages, the forced resettlement of Frankish colonists on Saxon lands. He issued laws, the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, that imposed the death penalty for a staggering range of offenses. Refusing baptism, death. Eating meat during Lent, death. Cremating the dead in the pagan fashion, death. Practicing any form of traditional Saxon religion, death. The Saxons were to be Christian, or they were to be dead. There was no middle ground. Slowly, painfully, the resistance crumbled. Widukind himself finally submitted in 785, accepting baptism with Charlemagne standing as his godfather, the same arrangement that would later be used with the Viking Guthrum and Alfred the Great. Other chieftains followed. The deportations continued, scattering the Saxon population across the Frankish Empire, breaking up the tribal structures that had sustained resistance. By the end of the century, the Saxon Wars were over. The Saxons had been absorbed into the Carolingian Empire. Their sacred groves had been cut down, their holy sites converted into churches, their priests and shamans executed or driven into hiding. Within a few generations, they would be as Christian as any other people in Europe, their pagan past surviving only in fragments of folklore and the names of days of the week. But the memory of what had been done to them did not fade. Now let us speak of why this matters for our story of the Vikings. The Saxon Wars took place during the same decades when Viking raids were beginning. The sack of Lindisfarne occurred in 793, while Charlemagne was still fighting to suppress Saxon resistance. The Norse were watching. They could not have failed to notice what was happening just to the south of their homelands. They saw a great Christian king making war on a pagan people who worshipped the same gods they did. They saw mass executions, forced conversions, the destruction of sacred sites. They saw what happened to heathens who resisted the advance of the cross. And they learned. The Vikings learned that Christianity was not merely a religion, it was a political force, an ideology of conquest, a justification for the destruction of everything they held sacred. The missionaries who would later come to Scandinavia, preaching peace and love, represented the same faith that had slaughtered 4,500 Saxons in a single afternoon. This knowledge shaped Viking attitudes toward Christianity for generations. Some Vikings converted willingly, seeing advantages in adopting the faith of their trading partners and potential allies. But many others resisted, viewing Christianity as an existential threat to their way of life. The ferocity with which they attacked monasteries and churches was not random violence. It was, in part, a response to what they had seen done in the name of the Christian God. The Saxons served as a warning. They showed the Vikings what could happen if they were conquered, what awaited them if they failed to defend their lands and their faith. The burned villages and scattered refugees, the executed chieftains and suppressed traditions, all of this awaited the Norse if they allowed the Frankish tide to wash over them. This is not to excuse the violence of the Viking raids. The monasteries they burned were filled with men who had taken no part in the Saxon wars. The monks they killed and the peasants they enslaved were innocents, guilty of nothing but being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Vikings were not freedom fighters or avengers. They were raiders, seeking wealth and glory, taking advantage of the weakness they found. But context matters. The world the Vikings inhabited was one of brutal religious warfare, where conversion was often achieved through massacre, where the choice was frequently between baptism and death. They saw Christianity not as we might see it today, as a faith of peace and compassion, but as they experienced it in their own time, as a conquering force that destroyed everything it could not absorb. The Saxon Wars also showed the Vikings something else: the vulnerability of the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne had spent 3 decades trying to subdue a single people, and even he, the greatest king of his age, had struggled to maintain control. The empire he built was vast, but it was stretched thin. Its defenses were concentrated on certain fronts, leaving others exposed. The Vikings exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. They raided the coasts and rivers that Charlemagne had neglected while focused on his Saxon campaigns. They took advantage of the civil wars that racked the empire after his death, playing the feuding Carolingian princes against each other. They learned from the Saxon example, not just the warning it represented, but the opportunities it revealed. Let yourself drift eastward now, along the great rivers that flow through the heart of the continent. We are leaving the familiar world of Scandinavia behind, traveling into vast forests and endless plains, into a land that would one day bear the name of the people who settled it. Russia, the land of the Rus. But who were the Rus? Where did they come from? And what became of them, so far from the salt spray of the northern seas? The answer is both simple and strange. The Rus were Vikings, Scandinavians who had traveled east along the trade routes, seeking the same wealth and opportunity that drew their cousins west to Britain and Francia. But in the east, something different happened. The Rus did not simply raid and return. They stayed. They settled. They intermarried with the local peoples. And over generations they became something new, no longer purely Scandinavian, not yet fully Slavic, but a blend of both, a people forged in the meeting of 2 worlds. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow heavy and warm. The rivers are calm tonight, reflecting the stars above, and the story flows as gently as the water. The local Slavic populations viewed the Rus with a mixture of fear and pragmatism. These were foreign warriors, armed and dangerous, capable of violence when they chose. But they were also traders who brought goods that could not be obtained elsewhere, who connected the isolated Slavic communities to the wider world. A relationship developed, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, always complex. According to the primary chronicle, the foundational text of Russian history, the Slavic tribes eventually invited the Rus to rule over them. The chronicle quotes the Slavs as saying, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and reign as princes over us." Whether this invitation actually happened as described is doubtful. Medieval chronicles often invented convenient origins for ruling dynasties. But the story captures something true about the Rus experience. They did not conquer the Slavic lands through overwhelming military force, the way Charlemagne had conquered the Saxons. They inserted themselves into existing power structures, becoming the warrior elite who protected and exploited the local populations in equal measure. The legendary founder of the Rus dynasty was a chieftain named Rurik, who according to tradition established himself at Novgorod in 862. His descendants, the Rurikids, would rule various Russian principalities for over 700 years, until the dynasty finally died out in the late 16th century. Rurik himself remains a shadowy figure, more legend than history. But his successors are better documented, and their achievements were remarkable. Within a few generations, the Rus had established a powerful state centered on Kiev, the city that would become the mother of Russian civilization. Now let us speak of how the Rus changed, how they became something different from the Vikings who had first traveled east. The transformation was gradual but profound. The Rus adopted the Slavic language, finding it more practical for dealing with the majority of the population they ruled. They adopted Slavic customs, intermarrying with local families, raising children who were as much Slavic as Scandinavian. They adopted, eventually, the Slavic religion, though this would later give way to Christianity. By the 10th century, the rulers of Kiev bore Scandinavian names, Igor, Olga, Sviatoslav, but they governed in ways that owed as much to Byzantine and Slavic tradition as to Norse practice. The longships still sailed the rivers, but the Rus were no longer Vikings in any meaningful sense. They had become Russians, the founders of a civilization that would one day span 11 time zones. This transformation was not unique. The same process occurred wherever Vikings settled in large numbers, in Normandy, in the Danelaw of England, in the Norse territories of Ireland and Scotland. The Vikings were remarkably adaptable, absorbing the cultures they encountered even as they imposed their own will upon them. Within a few generations, the fierce raiders became farmers and traders, lords and priests, indistinguishable from their neighbors. But the Rus transformation had a particular character, shaped by the unique circumstances of the East. They were far from Scandinavia, weeks of travel, through dangerous territory, with no guarantee of safe return. They were few in number, vastly outnumbered by the Slavic populations they ruled. They had to adapt to survive, had to become part of the land they had claimed, had to make common cause with the peoples they had once raided. And they did. The Rus married Slavic wives and raised Slavic children. They learned Slavic languages and adopted Slavic names. They worshipped at Slavic shrines and later, in Slavic churches. Now let us speak of the relationship between the Rus and their Scandinavian cousins. The connection was never entirely severed. Trade continued to flow between Scandinavia and the Rus territories, and warriors traveled in both directions seeking fortune and glory. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople recruited heavily from both regions, Norse and Rus fighting side by side in the service of the Byzantine Emperor. But there were also tensions. The Rus had carved out their own sphere of influence, and they did not always welcome competition from other Scandinavians. When Swedish Vikings tried to establish their own presence in the East, they sometimes found themselves in conflict with the Rus who had arrived first. The rivers were profitable, and the Rus had no intention of sharing. There are hints in the sources of rivalries and conflicts, of Rus princes defending their territories against Scandinavian interlopers. The details are murky. The chronicles of the period were more interested in wars against Byzantines and steppe nomads than in quarrels between different groups of Norse. But the pattern is clear. The Rus had become a power in their own right, and they acted to protect their interests against all comers. This included, occasionally, their own kin. The Vikings who traveled east in later centuries found themselves dealing not with fellow Scandinavians but with a foreign power. The Rus princes might share distant ancestry with the kings of Denmark and Norway, but they had different interests, different concerns, different identities. They were as likely to be rivals as allies, as likely to fight as to cooperate. This was the fate of the Viking diaspora everywhere. The Norse who settled abroad became part of their new homelands, and their loyalties shifted accordingly. A Norman duke might trace his lineage back to Rollo the Viking, but his interests lay in France, not Scandinavia. A Rus prince might remember the sagas of his ancestors, but his W. Let yourself drift westward now, across the cold gray waters of the North Atlantic, farther than any European had ever sailed before. We are leaving the known world behind, the familiar shores of Scandinavia, the islands of Britain and Ireland, even the remote outposts of Iceland and Greenland. We are traveling to the edge of the world, to lands that existed only in rumor and legend. We are traveling to Vinland, to America. The Vikings were the first Europeans to reach the shores of North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus set sail from Spain. They came seeking timber and grazing land, driven westward by the same hunger for resources that had sent their ancestors raiding across Europe. They found what they were looking for, and something more. They found people. People who were already there. People who had no intention of sharing their lands with strangers from across the sea. The Norse called them Skraelings. It was not a kind word, it meant something like wretches, or screechers, a dismissive term for people the Vikings considered primitive and savage. But these supposed primitives would prove to be the force that ended the Viking dream of a new world. They would drive the Norse back across the ocean, ensuring that America would remain unknown to Europe for another 5 centuries. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow heavy and still. The waves are long and slow out here, far from any shore, and the story unfolds like the endless horizon itself. The story of Viking America begins with a man named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, the founder of the Greenland colony. Around the year 1000, Leif sailed west from Greenland, following rumors of lands that had been sighted by earlier sailors blown off course. He found them, first a barren, rocky coast he called Helgeland, probably Baffin Island, then a forested shore he called Markland, probably Labrador, and finally a land of mild climate and abundant resources he called Vinland, for the wild grapes that grew there. Where exactly Vinland was located has been debated for centuries. The only confirmed Viking site in North America is at Lanseaux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, a small settlement of turf-walled buildings that was occupied for perhaps a few years around the turn of the millennium. But the sagas describe Vinland as a place of greater warmth than Newfoundland offers, with grapes and self-sown wheat, suggesting that the Vikings may have explored further south, perhaps as far as New England or beyond. What is certain is that they found a land of abundance. After the harsh conditions of Greenland, the barren rock, the grinding poverty, the constant struggle to survive, Vinland must have seemed like paradise. Timber for building, something Greenland utterly lacked. Pastures for cattle. Rivers teeming with salmon. Forests full of game. Everything a colony needed to thrive. And yet the Vikings did not stay. They tried. The sagas record several attempts to establish permanent settlements in Vinland. Leif's brother Thorvald led an expedition. A man named Thor Finnkarlsefni brought an entire colonizing party, including women and livestock, intending to create a lasting community. For a few years, perhaps, the dream seemed possible. Then they met the Skraelings. The first encounters were cautious but not hostile. The sagas describe the Skraelings approaching the Norse settlement in skin boats, curious about these strange pale people with their odd clothes and unfamiliar tools. The Vikings offered them milk to drink, a novelty for people who had no dairy animals, and traded red cloth for furs. For a time, something like peace prevailed. But peace could not last. The cultures were too different, the misunderstandings too easy, the stakes too high. The sagas give different accounts of how violence began. In one version, a Viking bull charged out of the forest, terrifying the Skraelings and triggering a fight. In another, the Skraelings attempted to steal weapons and were killed in the process, their kinsmen returning for revenge. Whatever the immediate cause, the result was war. And in war, the Vikings found themselves outmatched. This was a new experience for the Norse. They were accustomed to being the aggressors, the ones who struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. In Europe, the sight of a Viking longship on the horizon sent villagers fleeing and priests praying. But in Vinland, the Vikings were the ones who were afraid. The Skraelings were numerous. The sagas speak of skin boats arriving in such quantities that the sea seemed covered with them. Each boat carried warriors, armed with bows and stone-tipped arrows, with clubs and spears, with weapons suited to the land they knew intimately. They knew the forests, knew the rivers, knew where to hide and where to strike. The Vikings were strangers, fighting in unfamiliar terrain, far from any reinforcement. The sagas record several battles, each one chipping away at the Viking numbers and morale. The Norse won some of these encounters, driving off the attackers through sheer ferocity. But they could not win them all. And unlike in Europe, where defeated people might sue for peace, the Skraelings simply withdrew into the forest, regrouping for the next attack. The Vikings had no way to pursue them. They did not know the land, did not know the trails, could not track their enemies through the wilderness. They could hold their settlement, perhaps, but they could not pacify the surrounding territory. Every hunting party, every timber-cutting expedition, every group that ventured beyond the walls was at risk of ambush. And the Skraelings kept coming. They seemed inexhaustible, an endless supply of warriors emerging from the forest, from across the water, from somewhere the Vikings could not reach. The Norse were a small band of colonists, far from home, with limited weapons and no prospect of reinforcement. The Skraelings were a native population, fighting for their homeland, with the resources of an entire continent behind them. The mathematics were merciless. The Vikings could not sustain their losses. Every man killed was a man who could not be replaced. Every battle, even a victory, weakened them further. They were bleeding to death, slowly but surely, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. There is a remarkable scene in the saga of the Greenlanders that captures this moment of crisis. During one attack, the Skraelings drove the Vikings back toward the sea, the Norse warriors fleeing in panic, their shield wall broken, their courage failing. Only one person stood firm, a woman named Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red, who was pregnant at the time. Freydis seized a sword from a fallen warrior and turned to face the attackers. She bared her breast and struck it with the flat of the blade, screaming defiance at the Skraelings. And they stopped. The decision to abandon Vinland was not made in a single moment. It was a gradual recognition, building over months and years, that the dream could not be realized. The land was rich, yes. The resources were abundant. But the cost of holding them was too high. Thorfinn Karlsefni, who had led the most serious colonization attempt, finally gave the order to withdraw. His people loaded their ships with the timber and furs they had gathered, and they sailed back to Greenland, leaving Vinland to the Skraelings. They would not return. The sagas record Karlsefni's assessment with devastating simplicity. They realized that even though the land was excellent, they would be constantly at risk of attack from the people who already lived there. That was it. The end of Viking America. Not with a climactic battle or a heroic last stand, but with a quiet acknowledgement that some fights cannot be won. The Vikings had met an enemy they could not defeat, and they had the wisdom, or the pragmatism, to recognize it. This was not cowardice. The Vikings were many things, but they were not cowards. It was calculation, the same cold assessment of odds that had made them so successful elsewhere. In Europe, they had found divided kingdoms and undefended coasts, easy targets that yielded rich rewards. In Vinland, they found a unified and determined population, fighting on their own ground, with nothing to lose and everything to gain. The Vikings chose to cut their losses. It was the smart decision. It was, perhaps, the only decision that could have been made. But it marked a limit, a boundary to Viking expansion that could not be crossed. The Atlantic was not a highway to endless new lands. It was a barrier, separating the world the Vikings knew from the world they could never conquer. Vinland would remain a dream, a story told in sagas, a might-have-been that haunted the Norse imagination for centuries. Let yourself sink now into the deepest rest of all. We have traveled so far together, you and I, across cold northern seas and through ancient forests, into the courts of emperors and the camps of warriors, from the fjords of Scandinavia to the shores of a distant new world. We have met the peoples the Vikings feared, learned the lessons they taught, watched as the world of the longships slowly, gently, came to its end. Now we come to the final chapter. The twilight of the Viking Age. The quiet transformation that turned the fiercest raiders in history into something else entirely. Farmers and traders, lords and priests, the ancestors of peaceful nations that would one day be known not for conquest but for compromise. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow so heavy it seems to merge with the bed beneath you. The story is almost over now, and sleep is waiting just beyond the final words. The Viking Age did not end with a battle. There was no final defeat, no last stand of the old ways against the new. It ended the way most ages end, gradually, imperceptibly, one small change at a time, until one day people looked around and realized that the world had become something different, while they were not watching. The raids grew less frequent. The young men who might once have sailed west seeking silver found other paths to fortune: trade, farming, service in the courts of Christian kings. The longships still sailed, but they carried cargo now more often than warriors. The great fleets that had once terrorized the coasts of Europe dispersed, their crews settling down, their captains becoming merchants instead of marauders. The reasons were many. We have explored them all in our journey, one by one, and now they come together like streams joining to form a river. The Targets had learned to defend themselves. The Franks had built their fortified bridges, the English their buzz, the Irish their round towers. The easy days of raiding undefended monasteries were over. Every attack now meant facing soldiers who had been trained specifically to fight Vikings, walls that had been built specifically to stop them, navies that had been created specifically to intercept them. The cost had risen while the rewards had fallen. The monasteries had been plundered so many times that little remained worth taking. The towns had learned to hide their wealth, to evacuate before the raiders arrived, to leave nothing behind but empty buildings and scorched earth. A Viking expedition that might once have returned with holds full of silver now often came home with barely enough to cover the cost of the voyage. And there were other opportunities. The trade routes to the east offered profits without the risks of raiding. The settlements in Iceland and Greenland offered land for younger sons who could not inherit at home. The service of foreign kings, the Varangian. The transformation was generational. The men who had raided in their youth settled down in their middle age, taking up farming or trading, building families and accumulating property. Their sons might still hear the old stories, might still dream of glory on distant shores, but they also saw the comfort their fathers had achieved through peaceful means. And their grandsons knew the Viking Age only as legend, tales told by the fire on long winter nights, increasingly distant, increasingly mythologized. Each generation was a little less Viking than the one before. A little more settled, a little more Christian, a little more integrated into the wider European world. The change was so gradual that no one noticed it happening. There was no moment when someone declared the Viking Age over. It simply faded, like morning mist burning off under the rising sun. The longships themselves changed. The sleek, shallow-drafted warships gave way to deeper, broader trading vessels, the Nar and the Cog, designed to carry cargo rather than warriors. These ships were slower but more capacious, better suited to the peaceful commerce that increasingly defined Scandinavian life. The dragon prows that had struck terror into the hearts of Europe disappeared, replaced by plain wooden stems that announced no threat. The mead halls fell silent, one by one. The great feasts where skalds had sung of battles and heroes became less frequent, less elaborate. The poetry that had celebrated war and glory gave way to hymns and psalms, to the gentle rhythms of Christian worship. The old stories were still told, but they were told differently now, not as guides for life but as entertainment, not as religion but as legend. But let us also speak of what was gained. For the end of the Viking Age was not simply an ending. It was a beginning. The Scandinavian kingdoms that emerged from the Viking Age became stable, prosperous nations. They developed legal systems that protected the weak as well as the strong. They built churches and monasteries that became centers of learning, preserving not only Christian texts but also the ancient sagas and poems of the pagan past. They established trade relationships that brought wealth without the need for violence. The people who had once been the terror of Europe became its neighbors, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, but no longer an existential threat. The monks who had prayed for deliverance from the fury of the Northmen found themselves working alongside Scandinavian priests, sharing manuscripts and ideas. The same creative energy that had built the longships now built cathedrals. And the memory remained. The Vikings had written themselves into history so deeply that they could never be forgotten. Their achievements, The explorations, the settlements, the sheer audacity of their vision, became part of the common heritage of humanity. The dragon prows might have disappeared, but the stories of the men who had sailed beneath them would echo through the centuries. Today, 1,000 years later, the Vikings are more famous than ever. They appear in our movies and television shows, our books and video games. We name sports teams after them and wear their symbols as jewelry. We are fascinated by them, by their courage and cruelty, their artistry and violence, their world that was so different from ours and yet somehow speaks to something deep within us. This fascination is the final legacy of the Viking Age. The Northmen succeeded in something that most people never achieve. They made themselves unforgettable. The empires they failed to build have crumbled. The monasteries they raided have been rebuilt. But their names and deeds live. And now, at last, we come to the end. The Viking Age is over. The longships have made their final voyages. The warriors have laid down their axes and picked up plowshares. The old gods have retreated into memory, and the new god watches over lands that were once the terror of Christendom. The fjords are quiet now. The waves lap gently against shores that have seen so much history. The mountains stand as they have always stood, silent witnesses to everything that has passed beneath them. The stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, the same stars that guided the Vikings across unknown oceans, the same stars that now watch over their descendants as they sleep. Everything changes. Everything passes. The fiercest warriors grow old and die. The mightiest empires crumble to dust. The gods themselves fade when the last believer closes their eyes. This is the way of all things, and the Vikings knew it better than most. They sang of Ragnarok, the end of everything, and they faced it without despair. They understood that endings are part of the story, that twilight comes to every age. But endings are not erasures. The Vikings live on, in the languages spoken in Scandinavia today, in the words that English borrowed from Old Norse, in the stories that have been told and retold for 1,000 years. They live on in the spirit of exploration that sent their descendants to the poles and the peaks, to the depths of the ocean and the surface of the moon. They live on in the courage that still flames in human hearts when faced with the unknown. The Viking Age ended, but the Vikings never truly died. They became us, all of us, everywhere, who have ever looked at the horizon and wondered what lies beyond. They became the voice that whispers in the darkness, urging us to set sail, to take risks, to live fiercely and fully while we have the chance. Sleep now. The story is complete. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift like longships on a calm sea, moving gently toward the shore of dreams. The Vikings are at rest now, sleeping in their burial mounds and their churchyards, in their unmarked graves at the bottom of the sea. They have earned their rest, and so have you. The fire is burning low. The hall is growing dim. The storyteller's voice fades to a whisper, then to silence. The night wraps around you like a warm cloak, sheltering you from everything that lies outside this moment, this breath, this perfect stillness. You are safe. You are at peace. The battles are over, the voyage is complete, the fears faced and overcome. There is nothing left to do but rest. Let the twilight deepen. Let the stars turn slowly overhead. Let 1,000 years of history settle into the quiet of this moment. All the violence and glory, all the terror and wonder, all the lives lived and lost, let it all fade into the gentle darkness that welcomes you now. The Viking Age is over. And you are drifting now softly, slowly into sleep. Rest well. The story will always be here, waiting for you, whenever you want to return. But not tonight. Tonight there is only peace. Only rest. Only the deep, gentle quiet of the end of all stories. Sleep now. Sleep.